Welcome to a world where ancient voices still whisper through the winds. Step into the timeless stories of native tribes, filled with sacred rituals, powerful legends, and deep-rooted wisdom. Grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and prepare to walk the path of spirit, strength, and mystery. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your roots matter here. If these stories move you, give this video a like and subscribe for more sacred journeys. The drum beats are calling. Let the journey begin. They were called the Stone Sioux, and once ruled the plains in reed lodges painted with buffalo spirits. They danced under aurora-lit skies, waged war with razor-sharp coup sticks, and survived in frigid winter lands where even storms stood no chance. Today, modern Assiniboine communities rise again in Montana and Saskatchewan, reclaiming language, land, and identity in the face of erasure. They say the first Assiniboine came from the cracks in the earth, carried on stone wings that split the sky, a rolling thunder of presence before words existed. Their origin story begins with trembling rock, a spirit creature who shaped the land and taught the first people to listen to the wind. They lifted tippy poles not just to shelter, but to reach toward spirit. They buried elders facing sunrise so their souls could greet the day and guide the children who followed. Morning light in the grasslands dances across sagebrush and buffalo paths. It is here, on windswept plains tinged with purple and gold, that the Assiniboine learned to read the world as a living poem. Each ripple in grass was the breath of earth. Each bison distant on the horizon carried a blessing in its dust. This was a place not merely occupied, but sung to every step an offering, every trail a stanza. They called themselves Nakoda, friend or ally, because their first teaching was unity with sky, with stone, with herd and hearth. They were both gentle and fierce, warriors who painted wounds of enemies with bird feathers, healers who held healing stones pressed to chests. Their world was held together by contrasts, night and day, life and death, spirit and flesh, but it felt seamless, like sunrise revealing hidden shapes in the stone. In those early days, tippy circles moved across rivers and grass like stardust drifting over the night sky. Women set poles in earth like prayers. Men laid buffalo skins that would shape into homes designed to breathe, warm, and become ceremonial space. A lodge was never just a structure. Inside its walls were prayers woven into blankets, visions hidden behind beaded doors, and the sound of drums that spoke without words. Every child knew that trees aren't just trees, but relatives. Tulip bark wasn't just balm, but memory held in slender ribs. They ate rattleweed berries with understanding that nothing on the earth is accidental. Even the stones carried stories, voices of ancient beings waiting to share their echo. Their campfires were circles of conversation between present and past, revealing the roots of identity in flame light. Their bonds extended beyond family. Animals had kinship rights. Wolves were teachers. Elk were messengers. Bison were ancestors. Each hunt began with prayer. Each kill ended with ceremony. They spoke to the wind before they spoke to each other. They buried every bone with gratitude and turned skulls into carvings, not trophies. but reminders that life and death are breath apart. Spirit bundle ceremonies bound heart to stone to sky. Each bundle held sacred pieces, eagle feathers from a vision quest, quartz from trembling rock's playground, pieces of buffalo carved into prayer sticks. They were not displayed, they were carried, passed from elder to youth, telling the story that identity lives in gifts given, not claimed. Even as seasons changed from snow to blossom to burn, these teachings remained. They shaped wars not with rage, but with purpose. They shaped alliances not with treaties, but with shared ceremony. And when strangers on horses began cutting trails through the plains, the Nakoda did not panic. They listened, they waited, they tested reaction, not with arrows, but with silence. This opening chapter was not a myth told to entertain. It is the rock the rest of this story is carved from. Today's Assiniboines still carry those stones in memory. They still watch thunderheads with reverence. They still wrap tippy poles in prayer. They still listen. In the world of the Assiniboine, a circle was never just a shape. It was law, memory, protection, and promise. From the way their tippies were ranged to the way stories were told. Around fire, everything meaningful moved in a circle. And within that circle, life unfolded, not in straight lines, but in cycles. Like the moon pulling gently at the bones of the earth, the lodge was more than shelter. It breathed. It hummed with life. Each one stood like a silent guardian of the family, built from lodgepole pine and bison hides, stitched with care by hands that knew how to speak without words. Women shaped these lodges, and in doing so, they shaped the rhythm of the people's days, setting up, taking down, moving with the herds, always listening to the land's heartbeat. Inside the lodge, every person had a place. Elders sat nearest. The back, not just for warmth, but because their wisdom was the spine of the home. Children played near the doorway, close to the fire, learning the lessons flickering in shadow and light. Men returned from hunts and rested where the wind couldn't reach, speaking in soft tones so as not to disturb the sacred silence of the domestic world. Meals were shared as ceremony, meat roasted slowly over coals, pounded choke cherries mixed with buffalo fat to make pemmican, the traveler's strength. Berries were dried in the sun, fish smoked with patience, corn ground in rhythm. Every bite had a history, every recipe a root. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken without thanks. Roles were fluid, but full of purpose. Women were the architects of movement, building, packing, tanning hides, preparing medicine. They were keepers of the hearth and the healers of the body. Men, hunters and warriors, moved with the herds, read tracks, interpreted the sky. But leadership wasn't about domination. It came through quiet knowledge, the ability to guide, not shout. Children were raised communally. No child belonged only to one set of hands. A girl might learn to bead from her aunt, hear stories from her grandfather, and be disciplined by a cousin's mother. This web of guidance gave them both strength and humility. By the time a child reached 10 winters, they already carried the weight of memory like a second skin. And always, at the center of the home, burned a fire. It was the fire that remembered births and deaths, that heard the names of those long gone. At night, under blankets of hide and cloud, They'd gather close and tell stories of how the stars came to be. They'd speak of a coyote who tricked the moon, or a woman who turned into stone to protect her people. These stories weren't fiction. They were instruction wrapped in myth. Seasons moved them. Winter brought huddled warmth, songs sung low, hands busy with beading and carving. Spring meant renewal, births, new tipi coverings, scouting. Summer was trade, ceremony, gathering. Fall carried urgency, hunts, drying, preparing for snow. Each season wove another thread in the great lodge of their lives. Death, too, was part of the circle. The body returned to earth, sometimes raised on scaffolds, sometimes buried with belongings. Grief was not hidden, but honored. Loved ones cut their hair, painted their faces with ashes, sang songs of remembrance. The dead weren't gone, only ahead, watching from wind, stone, and flame. To the Assiniboine. To live fully meant to live well inside this circle, to give when you had, and receive when you didn't, to hold memory as tightly as you held your child, to trust the world's rhythm, its cycles of joy and pain, hunger and feast, silence and song. The lodge was both shelter and mirror. It reflected what you gave it. But the wind was beginning to carry new scents. The smell of smoke from distant camps not their own. The sound of iron wheels grinding distant plains. Strangers who did not know the circle were coming, and soon the Assiniboine would have to decide how to protect their lodge. Not just the hide and poles, but the spirit inside it. The northern wind does not pity the living or mourn the dead. It whispers through pine forests and across frozen plains, curling through the bones of those who once stood tall. The Assiniboine were not made soft by this world. They were carved by it, shaped by snow, by war, by a hunger that came not just for food, but for survival itself. Long before borders were scratched into maps, the Assiniboine were feared and respected across the northern Great Plains. They were scouts of the blizzard, riders who left no trail, archers whose arrows could split a rabbit's breath mid-run. They did not build walls. They moved faster than them. War was not a choice. It was a necessity born from scarcity, encroachment, and pride. To understand an Assiniboine warrior, you must understand that war was not recklessness. It was ritual. When a boy came of age, he fasted alone on a high ridge. He faced the wind until the cold cut into his marrow. He waited for a dream, for a sign from an animal or ancestor. If a hawk appeared in his vision, he might carry feathers into battle. If a bear came, he'd paint his chest with paw prints. Strength was not just in the limbs, it was in the soul. Marked by visions and silence, their enemies were many. The Lakota to the south, the Cree to the north, Blackfoot to the west. Sometimes peace was made, sometimes blood was spilled, and when it was time to strike, they moved in bands, 30 riders at most, fast, lean, silent, faces painted in red or black, horses trained to ride through brush without sound. A war cry might not be screamed until the last moment, sharp enough to snap through the lungs of the sleeping. Weapons were made by hand, built from wood, sinew, and metal scraps traded or scavenged. The bow was sacred, often passed down through generations. Knives were kept sharp enough to split sinew, but also slice open a ceremonial pouch. Lances bore charms, bones, and bits of fur. To carry a weapon was to carry the spirit of every battle before yours. With wits, the Assiniboine were masters of ambush, decoy, and bluff. They understood the land, knew where the elk trails turned, where the rivers froze thin. They could vanish into the trees before your second glance, then reappear behind your campfire. They rode with their shields close and their stories closer. Victory did not always mean conquest. Sometimes it meant stealing horses, a quiet, deadly game played under moonlight. Sometimes it meant rescuing a captured brother, or escorting a wounded comrade back home. Each warrior carried his deeds like scars, visible or invisible. Around the fire, stories were told, not to boast, but to remember. But memory cuts both ways. There were winters when food was low, and battles were fought just to reach a hunting ground. There were raids that went wrong, blood frozen in the snow before it could be mourned. Songs were sung for the fallen, feasts held in their name. Women would pierce their skin in grief. Fathers would go quiet for weeks. A warrior's death was holy, but never easy as guns arrived, traded through French and British. The rhythm of war changed. Arrows gave way to powder, tactics shifted. But honor still clung to the old ways. A gun did not erase a vision. A bullet did not silence a dream. Even as death became quicker, the heart of the warrior remained tied to the rituals of fire, feathers, and frost taught by the 1800s. The battles grew colder, not just in weather, but in meaning. The enemies were no longer just other tribes, but soldiers, surveyors, and treaties laced with lies. The northern plains began to shrink. The sky felt further away. Yet even as their numbers thinned, the Assiniboine did not forget who they were. Sons of the blizzard, archers of the wind. Today, their war songs are still remembered. Their stories told in lodges, in classrooms, and on stages. The weapons may now rest in glass cases, but their names are still whispered when the first snow falls. Because to be Assiniboine is to remember, to ride through time like a shadow. That cannot be caught. The buffalo did not just feed the Assiniboine. It made them. It clothed them, sheltered them, and gave shape to their calendars, their tools, even their dreams. To hunt the buffalo was not just to kill, it was to participate in a sacred exchange between the seen and the unseen. And in this world of hooves and spirits, the hunter and the healer stood side by side, one with a blade, the other with a bundle of bones and breath. The great buffalo herds once covered the northern plains like a living tide. Their hooves thundered louder than storms, and their migrations were as old as time itself. The Assiniboine knew their patterns, when to wait, when to strike. Entire bands moved with the herds, setting up camps near river bends or along hidden ridges. The buffalo came, and with them came life. But the hunt was more than survival. It was ceremony. The warriors who rode out did not go blindly. They painted their faces with red ochre or charcoal, whispered prayers to the sky, and tied talismans into their horses' mane. Some wore the skins of coyotes or wolves to sneak closer. Others waited on cliff edges, using hand signals and ancient tactics, passed down like heirlooms. Every movement was choreographed, a dance between blood and grace. When the first arrow struck, it was like a spark in dry grass. The herd roared into motion, the air filled with dust and screams. The Assiniboine gave chase on horseback, bows drawn, muscles tense, their ponies trained to ride close enough to touch the buffalo's flank. A clean kill was honored, a wounded beast was mourned. Afterward, they gathered around the fallen, not just to butcher, but to give thanks. From one buffalo came many gifts, the hide for teepees and robes, the bones for tools, the stomach for water sacks, the sinew for bowstrings. The skull was sacred, often placed on a small altar facing the rising sun. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was treated as ordinary dot, and once the hunt was over, the spirit keepers stepped forward. These were not warriors, they were not chiefs, but they held a different kind of power, one that moved through dreams, herbs, and silence. The spirit keepers could sense illness before it struck. They spoke with ancestors through vision quests, read the language of birds and winds, and carried medicine bundles older than memory. They were taught not to chase spirits, but to wait until spirits came to them. Children were taught early not to fear these people. They were seen in ceremonies, whispering into fires, placing their hands on fevered brows, or painting bones with ash. Their huts were filled with dried plants, animal parts, feathers, carved stones, a sacred mess of healing and myth. At night, they told stories of the twin brothers who created the stars, of the coyote who tricked death, of the buffalo who offered itself so humans would not starve. Women could be spirit keepers too. Their connection to life, through birth, song, and grief, gave them a sacred edge. Some women were known to walk between worlds. When lightning struck or a rare animal was seen, they knew what it meant. They read signs in dreams the way others read smoke or tracks. Their wisdom was sought in decisions, marriages, and battles. Sometimes, the spirit keepers would retreat alone for days, returning with new rituals, new songs, or warnings of what was to come. They were not feared, but respected, sometimes even more than chiefs. When the buffalo began to vanish, it was these people who first felt the silence. They said the land was hurting. They said something was coming that could not be fought. With bows, and they were right. The arrival of traders, guns, and diseases changed the buffalo's path forever. Hunts became harder. Herds began to shrink. The sacred balance started to fracture. But the spirit keepers kept lighting fires. They taught the children what each bone meant, what each dream might reveal. Even when the meat grew scarce, the stories did not. Today, the buffalo walk mostly in parks and protected lands. But for the Assiniboine, they still live in memory, in the songs passed down, in the artwork carved into wood, and in the ceremonies that echoed the sound of hooves that once shook the earth. Because while flesh fades, the spirit does not. It did not gallop, but it screamed. It did not bleed, but it ate the land when the iron horse came. It did not bring warriors, it brought something worse. Time divided, borders carved, and a future that did not ask permission for the Assiniboine. The train was more than a machine. It was the beginning of forgetting. Before the railroads, the northern plains breathed in slow rhythm. Life moved with the sun, with the herds, with the thawing of rivers and the migration of birds. But the iron horse moved to a different beat, one made of clocks and whistles and the ticking of government plans. Steel rails sliced through. Sacred spaces cut across old buffalo trails and split the land like a scar that would never fully close. The first tracks came under the banner of progress, or so the white men said. But for the Assiniboine, these tracks came with armed surveyors, false treaties, and whispers of reservation borders. The locomotives, heavy with timber and coal, rolled through territories where prayers once rose like smoke. They brought settlers in droves, and with them came fences, farms, and laws that knew nothing of spirit or ceremony. The buffalo felt it first. The herds, once numbering in the millions, had already started to dwindle from overhunting. But the trains hastened their death. Sportsmen fired rifles from passenger windows. Shipping companies stuffed the carcasses into boxcars for profit. The iron horse didn't just steal land. It shattered ecosystems. The grasslands dried, the rivers shifted, and the people who once danced with the rhythms of nature were left chasing the memory of hooves that no longer came. For the Assiniboine, movement had always been freedom, but the railroads made them still. The U.S. and Canadian governments used the new train lines to corral tribes into tight parcels of land. Land often too barren to farm, too distant from traditional hunting grounds. Entire families were displaced. Villages were burned or abandoned. Soldiers traveled the same rails that once carried furs and sugar, now with guns and orders to contain the Indian problem. The iron horse also brought another weapon, paperwork. With it came agents, census takers, and men in suits who spoke in contracts and broken promises. The language of ink replaced the language of drums. Land was no longer sacred. It was surveyed, divided, and sold. Ancestral grounds became mining plots. Burial sites were flattened for depots and stations. One stroke of a pen could now undo centuries of belonging. And yet, the Assiniboine did not vanish. They found ways to resist. Even in stillness, elders held councils by candlelight. Secret ceremonies continued behind closed doors. Children were taught to remember, not just with words, but with songs, carvings, and stories. Women gathered herbs where they still grew wild, crafting medicines in defiance of the white man's apothecaries. Warriors became teachers. Hunters became guides, and spirit keepers began to dream of ways to walk the old path, even when the trail had been buried beneath rail and ruin. Some Assiniboine found work on the very tracks that once divided them. They loaded coal, laid rails, and watched as towns sprang up overnight, towns that would never carry their names. It was a bitter irony, building the machine that once broke them. But even then, they carried their culture in their silence. They wore braids beneath their work caps. They whispered old songs while stacking timber. They watched, and they waited. Today, trains still move across the northern plains, but they no longer hold the same power. What was once the iron horse is now just a machine. The fear has faded, but the memory has not, because the scars it left weren't only on the land. They were in the stories of a people forced to redefine themselves, without forgetting who they were. And in that redefinition, something sacred endured. There was a time when every mountain had a voice, every animal a prayer, and every carved symbol carried the breath of the ancestors. The Assiniboine once lived by these truths, not as stories, but as certainties. Their totems weren't decorations. They were extensions of self, protectors, and reminders. But when the missionaries came, with their crosses and Latin prayers, the totems were the first to be asked to kneel. The Jesuits arrived with polished shoes and soft voices, carrying holy books and foreign names for gods. They did not understand that the Assiniboine already believed in something higher. But it wasn't a man in the clouds. It was the thunderbird, the wind that moved through pine, the whisper of hooves across snow. It was the way a child was, born during an eclipse, or how a hawk circled twice before a journey. These weren't coincidences. These were omens, part of a sacred order. But to the missionaries, they were myths to be erased. And so began the quiet war, not one of blades and blood, but of belief. Totem poles were taken down. Some were burned. Others were hidden in caves or buried beside the bones of elders. Painted buffalo hides, once used to tell stories of battles, births, and visions, were seized, replaced by linen robes and gold-trimmed Bibles. Children were baptized in rivers that once held only ancestral rites, and old women were made to trade their medicine bundles for rosaries they did not understand. The Assiniboine didn't surrender all at once. The change was slow, filled with quiet pain. It came through boarding schools, where the names of spirit animals were forbidden and punished with soap and silence. It came through marriages performed under church steeples instead of beneath the wide, breathing sky. Ceremonial face paint was replaced with pressed collars. Sacred chants were replaced by hymns, but the rhythm of those hymns never quite matched the heartbeat of the land. Still, some elders resisted in their own way. They wove spirit symbols into beadwork, subtle and quiet, hiding them inside church clothes. They spoke to the young ones in whispers, not to teach rebellion, but remembrance. Don't forget the bear who watches the mountain, one grandmother said. Even if the priest tells you not to look, others walked between both worlds. They prayed in Latin by day and called to the ancestors by firelight. They sang psalms on Sunday, then told the old stories after nightfall, when the stars returned and the land listened better. In this quiet merging, something rare took shape. Not defeat, but transformation. Totems became hidden, but never lost. They adapted. The eagle who once flew on large skins now danced in jewelry. The wolf carved in bone now appeared in tattoos, symbols of fertility, of the moon and harvest, re-emerged in pottery and weavings, and in the dreams of the young. Stories began returning, not as folklore, but as instruction. Spirit animals came not to entertain, but to remind. The bison still stood watch, the raven still warned of lies, and the deer still taught kindness in silence. By the 20th century, the Missionaries' grip began to loosen. A slow cultural thaw spread across the plains. Churches still stood, but they no longer swallowed the old voices. Totems resurfaced. Sacred dances once banned were performed openly at powwows. Drums returned, and the carvings, made from bone, wood, and stone, once again carried more than just form. They carried memory. Today, Assiniboine artists walk a powerful line. Their sculptures, their beadwork, and their songs speak into tongues. One shaped by centuries of tradition, the other by the resilience of survival. They know that totems aren't just about animals or gods. They're about transformation, about adapting without vanishing, about holding onto flesh even when faith tries to rewrite it. And so, in the hands of the modern Assiniboine, the totems breathe again. But they also teach. They teach that you can lose your language, your land, even your name. But if the symbols survive, so does the soul. In the tall grass of the northern plains. The Assiniboine once rode free. No fences, no clocks, no lines on maps. But in 1876, freedom was folded into a document called Treaty 6. It was a sheet of parchment dressed in polite words and legal ink, offered in exchange for everything: land, language, sovereignty. The chiefs didn't sign it with dreams in their hearts. They signed it with buffalo blood still on their hands, and with winter breathing down their backs. The government promised food, medicine, tools, schools, protection in sickness and famine. But what they delivered was delay, deceit, and disease. The treaty was supposed to be a bridge. Instead, it became a trap. Words like forever and honor looked strong on paper. But paper does not bleed. Paper can be folded, ignored, lost. And that's what happened to the promises. The Assiniboine were not naive. They had seen what had happened to the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Métis. They knew what came after the buffalo vanished: hunger, dependency, and the slow suffocation of identity. But they also knew their children were starving, their elders dying of tuberculosis, their horses thin, so they signed, believing they were making a bargain to survive. What they received was bureaucracy and betrayal. Rations arrived late, if they arrived at all. The food was spoiled, the flour was moldy, the beef was gray. Medicine men were told they were no longer needed. The medicine chest promised in the treaty became nothing more than a symbol, and often an empty one. The government agents, sent to oversee the distribution of aid, often kept the best for themselves, doling out charity like punishment, not healing. Meanwhile, the prairie that once carried their ancestors became lines on a settler's deed. The rivers were claimed, the hunting grounds fenced, sacred burial sites became railroad cuts. And when they asked for the promises to be kept, the government pointed back at the paper, as if the ink could explain the silence in their bellies. Children were taken, sometimes with smiles, sometimes with force, and sent to Indian residential schools, where their hair was cut, their language punished, and their traditions called sin. The treaty hadn't mentioned this. It hadn't warned them that education meant erasure. Some Assiniboine elders said that the treaty wasn't really a promise. It was a trick dressed as a gift, a box with a hollow bottom. They spoke of the translators who left out words, of chiefs who signed with marks they didn't understand. They remembered the fire in the settlers' eyes, not warmth, but hunger. By the early 1900s, the reserves created by Treaty 6 were overrun with poverty and disease. Hunting was banned outside of designated zones. Ceremonies were criminalized. And when the Assiniboine protested, they were told, "You agreed to this." But they had never agreed to forget who they were. Still, not all was lost in ink. There were old men who remembered the stories before Treaty 6, women who stitched truth into beadwork, boys who listened at the edge of sweat lodges, and even within the system built to erase them, the Assiniboine found ways to bend without breaking. Some became lawyers, some became historians, some simply survived, and that, too, was a kind of defiance. Today, Treaty 6 still exists. It is cited in courts. It is referenced in debates. It is taught in schools, though often without its scars. But to the Assiniboine, it's not just a chapter in a textbook. It is a wound still open, still bleeding, but also still. Remember. And in that memory, there is strength. Because what vanished on paper never vanished from the people. The cold came early that year. It arrived not as snow, but as silence. A silence that settled over the lodge like a warning. The animals had gone quiet. The traps were empty. And the rations, the ones promised by the treaty, the ones that came by wagon and white man's pen, never arrived. The year was 1883. The place was a reserve whose name had been twisted by outside tongues. But to those inside it, the place was still called home. A small girl, no older than 8, began carving lines into a piece of birch bark. Not letters, not numbers, just marks. One for every day her stomach growled louder than her breath. This is not fiction. This is the living memory passed down from elder to elder. A story whispered by firelight to painful for full sentences. On the first day of winter, there was a stew of dry berries and bone scraps. By the second week, it was only snow boiled in silence. The parents told their children bedtime stories about the days when buffalo covered the plains, like moving hills. Now, they watched the children's ribs protrude like the bones of old teepee. Poles, hollow, and dry. The Indian agent said more food was coming. Said it was on the way. Said be patient. But the horses bringing it had no tracks. And patience does not fill a bowl. By midwinter, people stopped speaking. Not from obedience, from exhaustion. There is a kind of tired that goes beyond sleep, a kind where even memory starts to shrink. Elders forgot the names of stars. Mothers forgot the sound of their own songs. One boy chewed on leather, the strap of a long-dead warrior's pouch. He said it tasted like dreams. Another was found curled in the snow, lips blue, eyes wide open. He hadn't frozen. He had simply stopped waiting. And yet, the diary continued. The girl, now weaker, still scratched her marks into the birch bark. It wasn't for anyone. It wasn't a cry for help. It was defiance, proof that they were still counting, that they were still here. One day, a medicine woman named Niska gathered what little energy she had left. She took the children out to the frozen river. Remember, she whispered, This water knew our names before any treaty did. And then she sang, not a song of joy, but a chant, deep, trembling, made of sorrow and steel. Even the ice seemed to listen. By February, government wagons finally rolled in, not with apology, not with care, just crates. Inside were flour and beans and spoiled pork. The pork had turned green. 3 more died before spring. And still, the diary continued. The girl would live. She would grow old and become a grandmother with clouded eyes but a sharp tongue. And when her grandchildren asked her why she never trusted the government, she would show them the birch bark, now brittle with age, the diary of that winter. Do you see? She would say, every line here is someone's name, someone we never got to bury properly. What makes this chapter different is not that it tells a story of starvation. There are many. It is that this story was never officially written down. It didn't make it into the archives or the museums. It lived only in the breath of survivors. Starvation wasn't just the absence of food. It was the absence of listening, of truth, of care. And yet, the people endured. Because survival isn't just about eating. It's about remembering, about drawing marks on birch bark even when you can barely lift your hand. It's about singing to a frozen river because it's the only thing that hasn't lied to you. The drums never stopped. They just went quiet for a while. There was a time when the sound of the powwow drum was illegal. A time when dancing in feathers, speaking the old language, or gathering in the circle could land you in jail. But even through boarding schools, broken treaties, and the weight of erasure, the Assiniboine never let go of the rhythm. They held it in the soles of their feet, in the hush of their dreams. And when the time came to rise again, the drum was the first thing they brought back to life. This is not just a story of ceremony. It's the story of resistance, stitched in regalia, painted on banners, and shouted through bullhorns on the steps of Parliament. It's about a tribe that learned to turn survival into revival, and revival into rebellion. It began in the 1960s, when Assiniboine youth who had grown up on res roads and reservation dormitories began to ask questions. Why were their ceremonies mocked? Why were their lands still being leased, sold, or strip-mined without consent? And why did history books still treat their nation like a footnote? Some turned to education, arming themselves with law degrees and tribal records. Others turned to the drum, gathering in circles once outlawed, wearing beadwork once confiscated. Powwows became more than celebration. They became a statement, a declaration of visibility, a way of saying, we are still here, and we are watching. By the 1980s, these gatherings swelled. Grandmothers passed down forgotten songs. Children learned to dance with steps older than Canada itself. Elders told the young, dance not to entertain, dance to remember, dance to heal. But even as the music returned, the fight deepened. In 1990, when sacred Assiniboine land near Fort Belknap was threatened by development, protests erupted. Elders stood beside young warriors. Some wore feathers, others wore hoodies. One woman held a sign that read, "This land fed our great-grandfathers. Why do you think your profit matters more?" The media called it a land dispute. The Assiniboine called it survival. And the powwow drums beat in the background, steady as heartbeats. At every gathering, tents stood beside teepees. Native lawyers spoke beside singers. Children sold fry bread beside activists collecting signatures. The protest had changed shape. It wasn't a line of people blocking bulldozers. It was a movement living in culture, language, and law. And every powwow was a protest dressed in beauty. Some called it a contradiction, dancing while fighting. But for the Assiniboine, they were one and the same. To sing the buffalo song after it was once banned, that is protest. To speak Nakota in a courtroom, that is protest. To wear a headdress, not for tourists, but for ancestors, that is sacred rebellion. And it wasn't just for the tribe. Other First Nations began to notice. Youth from Cree, Lakota, and Salish tribes came to Assiniboine circles, drawn by the fire. The music, the fight, the revival rippled outward, inspiring. A generation that refused to be forgotten. By the early 2000s, a new phrase echoed at gatherings. Land back, language back, power back. Today, the powwow grounds on Fort Peck and Fort Belknap shine each summer like living monuments. Smoke from fry bread fires drifts beside the scent of sweet grass. Veterans in uniform march beside jingle dancers. Songs once whispered in fear are now blasted from loudspeakers. Elders cry. Young people rise. This is what revival looks like. Not perfect, not easy, but powerful. The world sees the feathers and the face paint. What it often misses is what lies underneath, a deep, unshakable pulse of resistance. So when you see an Assiniboine dancer spin on dusty grass under a prairie sun, know that it is not just choreography. It is memory. It is protest. It is a declaration that even after centuries of theft, fire, and silence, the story did not end. The story transformed. You can't hold a people in chains and then act surprised when they pull out a copy of the treaty. For the Assiniboine, sovereignty wasn't just an abstract right. It was blood memory, the echo of councils held in wine-draped teepees, of decisions carved into winter by survival. But as the crown extended its reach across the northern plains, the Assiniboine were drawn into a centuries-long legal storm, where promises made in good faith were often buried under piles of paper, legalese, and colonial loopholes. At the heart of it all, treaties, especially Treaty 6 and Treaty 4. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were real agreements, spoken and signed, often under pressure, often mistranslated, but always understood by the Assiniboine to mean one thing. You may pass through our lands, but we remain who we are. What followed, however, was not peace, but a steady erosion of that understanding. The Crown, backed by the Canadian state and British law, reinterpreted these treaties not as partnerships, but as permissions, licenses to rule, to divide, to relocate, to assimilate. And so began the courtroom wars, from dusty reservation offices to glass-paneled federal buildings. Generations of Assiniboine leaders have fought with quiet defiance. They brought oral histories to courtrooms built to silence them. They studied colonial law in order to dismantle it. They fought for land not just with spears, but with footnotes and case files. One of the earliest landmark struggles came in the form of Indian Act battles, where the very definition of who was Indian, and thus who had a right to live on ancestral land, was written by people who had never stepped foot on a prairie. Then came the question of hunting rights. In courtroom after courtroom, the Assiniboine argued, "Our people hunted buffalo before your laws had names. Our treaties said nothing about permits. Sometimes they won, sometimes they didn't. But with each hearing, they pushed the line back, inch by inch, toward justice. In 1999, a monumental case was brought forth by the Fort Belknap community, addressing grazing leases signed without tribal consent. The verdict mixed: a partial victory, a partial betrayal, just like most of history. But the moment mattered because it showed the nation that the Assiniboine were watching, documenting and preparing for the long fight ahead. Sovereignty, after all, was not about nostalgia. It was about power. What does it mean to govern yourself? For the Assiniboine, it means managing tribal schools where Nakota is taught in classrooms. It means holding elections, running hospitals, managing water systems, overseeing casinos, all under flags that fly beside, but never beneath, the Canadian or US banner. But it's never been easy. Courtrooms are expensive. Legal battles are draining. And for every win, there's a clause buried in bureaucracy ready to stall progress. Some victories take decades. Some require rewriting entire laws. Others depend on public pressure, marches, even hunger strikes. Yet still, they fight today. A new generation of Assiniboine legal warriors, some trained in tribal law, others in Canadian universities, continue to press forward. Their weapons are different, but their cause is the same as their ancestors: land, dignity, and the right to be who they've always been. Their arguments are not only legal, but emotional. We are not citizens begging for inclusion. One Assiniboine lawyer said before a federal panel, "We are nations demanding respect. Every case, every appeal, every affidavit is more than paperwork. It's a continuation of stories once told around firelight, stories that now unfold in fluorescent-lit courtrooms, whispered behind microphones, and echoed in headlines. Some say the law is cold, but for the Assiniboine, it is also a battlefield, and they've never forgotten how to fight. Some songs were never meant to fade. They lived in beadwork, in the lines of a painted tipi, in the silence between drum beats. For the Assiniboine, every carved pipe stem, every quill-wrapped cradle board, every rhythmic chant was more than art. It was memory. But colonization struck more than treaties and territories. It came for the invisible things: language, expression, the right to name the world in your own words. For decades, Assiniboine children were taken from their homes and sent to schools. That taught them to forget their tongue. They were punished for singing songs their grandmothers hummed while cooking. Their hands were forced to write English, while the Nakota syllables curled and died quietly in their throats. Now, after more than a century of silence, the songs are returning. The movement is not loud, but it is powerful. Across the Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, and Carry the Kettle communities, you'll find artists stitching language into life again. A young woman paints elk hide panels with scenes of buffalo hunts, but each figure is surrounded by Nakota words, glowing like subtitles from the ancestors. A group of elders meets every week to retell origin stories in the old dialect, their voices shaky but proud, and in a classroom lit by fluorescent lights. Third graders chant numbers, days of the week, and animal names, all in the language once nearly erased. The return isn't limited to memory or speech. It's etched into stone, projected onto glass, coded in pixels. Digital warriors, artists, linguists, coders are now rebuilding the Assiniboine language one database at a time. Interactive dictionaries, mobile apps, and audio libraries let you hear the breath of Nakota spoken aloud. For young people born into a world of swipes and streams, the smartphone becomes a vessel of cultural return, a medicine pouch of the modern age. This rebirth reaches further than words. It touches the way the tribe sees itself. In recent years, Assiniboine artists have begun encoding old spiritual symbols into modern works. Ceramic pieces shaped like ancient sweat lodge stones. Murals that blend graffiti with the colors of tribal regalia. Spoken word poems that shift between Nakota and English like wind between tippy flaps. It's not nostalgia, it's declaration. The culture isn't frozen in time, it is breathing, pulsing, evolving. Museums, once places that stole and silenced, are becoming allies, sometimes reluctantly. Collaborations between tribal historians and archivists have led to the digital return of sacred items. Buffalo robes scanned in high resolution, songs recorded on wax cylinders now converted to MP3 South. Objects once locked behind glass are now accessible to communities through digital. Repatriation, a quiet revolution of return. Pixel by pixel, and yet, the most powerful revolution is not technological, it's emotional. One elder, after hearing a remastered audio file of her grandfather's voice singing a morning song, wept for an hour. I forgot how deep his voice was, she whispered. It felt like he came home. That is the power of this moment, of this chapter in Assiniboine history. Not just remembering, but reviving. Not just restoring the past, but redesigning the future. Young people are reclaiming their birthright, their language, their art, their songs, and carrying them like torches across the plains. Even beadwork has changed. A teenage girl from the Carry the Kettle First Nation recently crafted a regalia shawl that showed not horses or feathers, but circuit boards, DNA strands, and the Nakota word for memory. It won first place at a powwow art show and started a national conversation about what traditional means when your traditions have never stopped changing. Because the Assiniboine are not a tribe of ruins, they are a nation of redesign, through stone and syllable, through app and artifact. Their story continues, not as a return to what once was, but as an evolution toward what still can be. The language may have dimmed, but it was never extinguished. The art may have gone quiet, but it never stopped breathing. And now, as songs rise from stone and circuits alike, we move into the final chapter, where the past and future meet not in mourning, but in motion, Where to remember is not enough. Where the next step is forward. Where the Assiniboine dream out loud. The buffalo used to thunder across the prairie in herds that shook the earth like drums. They weren't just food or hide. They were soul. Every part of the animal was used, revered, spoken to. The Assiniboine believed the buffalo gave itself willingly, a sacred pact between kin. When the buffalo fell, the people stood tall. When the buffalo vanished, the world began to break. And yet here we are, in the ashes of broken treaties, poisoned winters, vanished names. Something stirs, not softly, not secretly, but powerfully, like hooves returning to land that still remembers them. This is not just survival. It is return. The Assiniboine are no longer waiting to be remembered. They are remembering themselves, out loud, on their terms. They are building their own schools, planting their own languages into curriculum, carving their own economies into sovereign ground. Casino dollars are now flowing into community centers, scholarships, solar panels. Buffalo herds brought back to the land where their bones once rotted. Yes, the buffalo are back, and not as ghosts. In Fort Peck and Fort Belknap, the tribal lands now shelter hundreds of buffalo once thought lost to history. With careful reintroduction, ceremony, and sacred intent, the Assiniboine have restored more than a species. They have restored a mirror. To stand among those animals now is to feel time folded on itself, a child beside its ancestors, a hoof print. Inside a heartbeat. This is what the last chapter of colonization looks like. Not erasure, but uprising. Not assimilation, but assertion. A rebirth in the face of bureaucratic death sentences. A voice where once there was silence. A stampede. Not a fear, but a vision. Elders are passing down ceremonies once whispered only in dreams. Youth are dancing in powwow circles, wearing beadwork coded with constellations. Old stories are being animated and uploaded to YouTube in Nakota. Tribal constitutions are being revised, not in reaction to federal law, but in reflection of ancestral. Lord, the buffalo aren't the only ones reclaiming their range. And that name, Assiniboine, was once an outsider's word. The Nakota call themselves Nak-e, the people who speak the language of stone and snow. And now, across plains and courtrooms, stages and council fires, they are reminding the world who they've always been. What does it mean to rise? It means to refuse vanishing. It means to speak the language that was stolen, to wear the regalia that was mocked, to bury the dead with songs that colonizers tried to silence, to marry under the old stars, to bless newborns with names rooted in land, not paperwork. It means healing, not perfectly, not all at once, but steadily, like spring thaw across frozen prairie. In Browning, in Poplar, in Wolf Point and Canada's. Carry the kettle. Assiniboine voices are rising like smoke from sacred fires. And this time, no wind will scatter them. The stories are being written by those who lived them. The future is not being begged for. It's being built. They are no longer asking to be seen. They are arriving. And if you listen closely, you can hear it in the beat of the drum, in the crack of snow beneath returning hooves, in the laughter of children who know who they are. The buffalo have not just returned. The people have become the buffalo, moving together, watching the horizon, unstoppable. And this is not the end. This is the rise. This is the roar. This is the Assiniboine. And they are not just alive. They are charging into history once more. They call themselves people who sit together, but history rarely gave them the chance. Once a thriving ceremonial ground in the heart of Muskogee territory, the Kielegi tribal town was shattered by removals, silenced by colonization, and nearly erased in a fight over who gets to be official. Today, they remain landless, yet undefeated, preserving sacred fires and stories most Americans have never heard. This is the story of mysticism, removal, survival, and political defiance. This is the story of the Kielegi. Before maps carved the world into rectangles and laws divided people by blood, there were fires, not just flames to keep warm, but sacred circles where stories walked, where decisions were made in silence, and where memory was a living thing. In the forests and riverbanks of what's now Alabama, there sat a people who didn't call themselves a nation or a tribe, but a town. Their name was Kielegi, meaning the people who sit together. They were one of many ceremonial towns. In the Muskogee Confederacy, a union unlike anything the Western world had seen, there was no king, no single capital. Instead, there were dozens of towns, each like a human body with its own heart, its own rhythm, its own fire, and Kielegi's fire burned steady. It wasn't the largest town, but it was respected for its warriors, for its rituals, and most of all, for the way its people listened. In Kielegi, to speak out of turn was to disturb the balance of the world. Their square ground was sacred geometry for sides, for cardinal directions, for duties to the town. Elders sat on one side, warriors on another, ceremonial leaders on the third, and on the fourth, the youth, watching, learning, waiting for their time to enter the dance of responsibility. Every movement, every silence, every story passed from mouth to mouth was part of a larger ritual. Nothing was accidental, and nothing was forgotten. To the Kielegi, sitting together wasn't just about proximity. It meant agreement, harmony. It meant placing the needs of the town above the wants of the self. When decisions had to be made, they didn't shout. They sat. They listened. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Not because they were indecisive, but because they understood something deeper that hasty words could destroy. What sacred patience had built. There was no single chief in this way of life. Instead, there were leaders chosen by the ceremonial fires. Men and women selected not for wealth or popularity, but for wisdom, for calm, for the ability to hear what others could not. These leaders, called Meko, were more like stewards of balance than rulers of people. They kept the town from tipping, politically, spiritually, emotionally, and when the square ground fell silent, it was the Meko who spoke last, not first. The land around them was lush, tall trees that whispered when the wind passed, rivers that remembered where the canoes had gone. Children played beside those rivers, not realizing yet that they were being watched by the town's spirits, not imaginary ghosts, but real presences that lived in dreams, in wind, in the eyes of animals. The Kieleji lived with the belief that everything had memory, the soil, the birds, even the firewood, and that memory must be honored, or else it would remember the insult dot in this world. There were no straight lines. Life moved in cycles: birth, ceremony, war, forgiveness. Even death was a return, not an end. And so the people sat together, year after year, generation after generation, not to cling to the past, but to carry it. Their town was more than homes and walls. It was a heartbeat, a living ceremony, a way of existing that made room for contradiction, for mystery, for humility. But fires don't always get to choose their wind dot in the decades that followed. Outsiders would come. Treaties would be signed in foreign languages. Forced removals would turn sacred rivers into graves. The idea of a tribal town would become a footnote in the history books. Too complicated, too unique, too inconvenient, and yet the people of Kieleji never stopped sitting together. Even when scattered, they carried the square ground inside them, because a town built from memory cannot be burned. And now, as the firelight flickers at the edge of history, we step into the center of the circle to witness the force that kept their world spinning dot in the heart of the Kieleji town. There was no throne, no monument, no temple made of stone. There was only a fire, a living, breathing fire that burned at the center of the square ground. Its flickering light watched by all, but understood only by some. This wasn't just for warmth. This was ceremony. This was balance. The fire in the circle was their spiritual compass, their courtroom, their cathedral. Every ember was a memory, every spark a whisper from the ancestors. Around this fire, four arbors faced inward, forming the square. Each side had a purpose, one for warriors, one for elders, one for ceremonial leaders, one for youth. Together, they faced the fire, and by doing so, they faced the truth. The truth of what it meant to be Kieleji, to live in balance with yourself, your people, your spirit, and the land beneath your feet. When the green corn ceremony began, a sacred renewal that honored the first harvest of the season, the entire town transformed. Weeks before the first kernels ripened, the square ground was cleaned, the old fires extinguished, and preparations began for something beyond celebration. It was a ritual of forgiveness, a time to cleanse sins, to reset relationships, to rejoin the spiritual thread that connected every living soul to the world around them. Fathers who had argued with sons returned to the circle, heads bowed. Wives who had carried grief in silence sat in prayer. Children were taught that the corn wasn't just food, it was a promise. They fasted, they danced, they prayed, they watched the fire. The dance itself was not performance, it was offering. Every step around the circle honored the rhythm of life. Movements were slow, deliberate, mirroring the world's natural turns, sunrise to sunset, youth to age, spring to frost. Only those who were ritually clean could approach the fire. This cleansing wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. Old anger had to be cast off, jealousies confessed, wrongdoings forgiven, not through punishment, but through balance. Even enemies were welcomed back, as long as they came with open hands and open hearts. It wasn't weakness, it was sacred responsibility. Nearby, The ceremonial leaders sang, not in songs you'd recognize, but in syllables older than English, older than maps. These weren't just melodies, they were codes, stories folded into sound, instructions for how to live, hidden in breath and tone. The fire didn't just listen, it answered, crackling louder during certain songs, dimmer during others. Some say it spoke. Kieleji belief held that the fire was a messenger, a pathway between this world and the spirit world. The ancestors watched through the flames. Every prayer sent into that circle rose up in smoke. And so, people watched the fire not like a tool, but like a face, one that could smile, warn, or turn away. And then came the new fire at the climax of the green corn ceremony. After days of dancing, fasting, and prayer, the sacred fire that had been allowed to die was relit. This wasn't done casually. It was done with fire sticks, with ceremony, with sacred breath. When that flame rose again, the people cheered softly, some cried, because in that moment, the town was reborn. Old sins were gone, crops were blessed, the circle was whole again, even in exile, years later. When the town was relocated to Indian territory after forced removal, they brought this ritual with them. In Oklahoma's dry dust, they recreated the square ground. They planted new fire, because the fire in the circle wasn't about land. It was about connection. As long as the fire survived, the people did to an outsider. It might have looked like simple tradition, but for the Kieleji, it was the foundation of everything. Justice, identity, healing, survival. You could lose a home. You could lose a name. But if the fire still burned, you were still Kieleji. Even today, in hidden grounds not far from Tulsa, the ceremony continues, quietly, carefully, away from headlines and outsiders. The dances are slower now, the songs more fragile, but the fire is there, and those who sit in the circle know exactly what it means. Not a show, not a remnant, a sacred engine still turning. Because for the Kieleji, survival doesn't always look like a flag waving on a hill. Sometimes it's a flame, passed from hand to hand, never allowed to die. And as we sit by this fire, we begin to see something deeper. The warriors who once danced here weren't just defending territory. They were protecting a sacred world of balance, rhythm, and silence. They did not paint their faces with bright colors. They didn't charge with wild screams or clash swords under banners. The warriors of the Kieleji moved like shadows, quiet, watching, waiting, because to them, violence was not a show. It was balance restored. In the time before removal, when the forests were still thick with untouched canopy and the rivers still flowed where they pleased, the Kieleji were known across the Muskogee Confederacy not as aggressors, but as protectors. Their warriors didn't crave war, but when conflict came, they answered with precision and ceremony. Every battle had a spiritual weight. You didn't fight just because you were angry. You fought because this circle had been broken. Maybe someone had violated a sacred law. Maybe another town had disrespected their ceremonial grounds. Maybe a life had been taken unjustly. In those moments, the warriors were summoned, not as soldiers, but as sacred instruments of realignment. Before any mission, the warriors were cleansed in smoke and prayer. Elders would bless them, not for victory, but for clarity. They were taught that a warrior must first conquer his own rage before lifting a weapon, because anger blinds, and a blind man in battle is a danger to the town. They wore no armor, just paint, sometimes beads, soft moccasins. Their weapons were handmade, boughs carved from river trees, short clubs polished with oil and soot, knives hidden in armbands. But their greatest weapon was the silence. Kieleji warriors could move through woods without breaking twigs, stalk rivers without making ripples. They hunted like wolves, struck like wind, and left no trace but memory. Stories tell of raids conducted so quietly that enemies woke with half their supplies gone and no idea who had come. Not out of cruelty, out of message, a warning whispered instead of shouted. But even in moments of bloodshed, there were lines. You did not strike the innocent. You did not defile the dead. You did not kill for pride. If a warrior crossed these lines, he was not celebrated. He was mocked, shunned, in extreme cases, even cast out. Because to be a warrior in Kieleji life wasn't just about strength. It was about restraint, controlled power, measured fire. Punishments within the town also followed these beliefs. A man who struck another without cause might be sentenced to carry water for the entire town, a humiliating but healing act. Those who committed graver sins were purified in ceremony or sent away to the woods. For spiritual reckoning, no cages, no chains. Justice was about restoration, not domination. Young boys dreamed of being chosen to train, but they weren't handed weapons right away. They were taught first to listen, to sit with their elders in the square ground and absorb the rhythm of the town. Only when they could feel the invisible strings, connecting every face around the fire, only then were they given the chance to walk the warrior's path. And when they finally did, they were trained not just in war, but in peacekeeping. Many served as lullis, town guardians who settled disputes, protected ceremonies, and maintained harmony. Their silence was their authority, their presence a quiet shield. After removal, after the trail of tears scattered the ceremonial towns like ashes on wind, the warrior tradition didn't vanish, it transformed. The square grounds were rebuilt in Oklahoma, and the descendants of those warriors carried the same calm strength into new battles, courts, councils, protests. Their war clubs became legal arguments, their silence, political resilience, and still, today, their walk remains soft, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Because true warriors don't shout to prove they're strong. They protect the fire by becoming its shadow. And as we leave the quiet footsteps of the Kieleji protectors, we turn toward the deeper, stranger waters of the town's belief system. The world of forbidden foods, dream punishments, and sacred omens that ruled even sleep. In the world of the Kieleji, not everything could be seen, but everything could be felt. A bird's call at dawn, a shiver without wind, a snake slithering across a path just before a name was spoken. These weren't coincidences. They were messages, warnings, signs from The spirit world. For the Kieleji, life wasn't just physical, it was layered, like a river with depths unseen to the eye. And to survive in this world, one had to understand the rules, not the kind written down, but the ones passed through whispers, woven into stories, and bound by taboos older than memory. Food, for instance, had rules. Certain fish could not be eaten if caught on the wrong day. Some meats were forbidden to pregnant women, lest their child inherit bad dreams. Corn was sacred, but only if it had been blessed during the green corn ceremony. Eating it too early was not just disrespect, it was spiritual offense. The body, they believed, didn't just digest food. It absorbed its story. And then there were dreams. Among the Kieleji, dreams weren't idle flickers of the mind. They were portals, glimpses into a world just as real as this one, only hidden. A dream of a snake could mean sickness was coming. A dream of losing teeth might signal betrayal. Children were taught early to speak their dreams aloud each morning, so that an elder might interpret them and ward off what lurked beneath. Some dreams were so powerful, they changed lives. A warrior who dreamed of drowning might be excused from battle that season, not out of fear, but respect. To ignore a true dream was to invite imbalance. Even weddings could be delayed if the bride dreamed of a broken pot or a dark bird flying west. The town listened to dreams the way others listened to laws. Snakes, too, held power. They weren't symbols of evil, but of change, of transformation. To dream of a snake was to be warned. Something in your life must be shed, or it would be taken. Killing a snake was discouraged. But if one appeared near your home, it was believed a spirit was trying to communicate. The snake was not a threat. It was a question, and yet, with all their spiritual tolerance, some things were absolutely forbidden. A man who whistled at night could call spirits toward the square ground. A child who touched a ceremonial object without permission could be banned from future rites. The line between life and spirit was thin, and disrespect made it vanish. Even the direction one slept mattered. Heads faced east, where the sun rose. To sleep facing west was to invite the dead. Punishments were not cruel, but they were precise. A woman who broke a marriage taboo might be required to fast and purify herself with river water. For days, a man who lied during a ceremony could lose his speaking privileges in the square ground for an entire season. In a community so tied to spiritual balance, the worst crime wasn't violence, it was arrogance. Acting as if you were above the unseen laws. Children were not spared from these rules. They were raised within them. Even games had meanings. A ball game played till late in the evening might anger night spirits. A child who mocked a turtle could be marked for illness, unless they performed a respectful apology ritual. And while this might seem harsh through modern eyes, for the Kieleji, it wasn't about punishment. It was about protection from things not even warriors could fight. The elders, especially the women, were the keepers of these taboos. They watched the signs. They remembered the rules. And when something strange happened, a birth to silent, a bird circling the square, they were the ones who gathered in quiet circles to interpret. They didn't panic. They understood. Over time, as forced removal pulled Kieleji people west. Many of these taboos were tested. The land changed. The air felt different. But the rules remained, carried in memory, practiced in secret, whispered into the ears of sleeping children. Even now, some Kieleji families teach their children not to whistle at night, not to eat corn from the can without prayer, not to laugh at dreams, even the strange ones, because somewhere, deep inside the modern world, the old world still watches. And so the Kieleji walked carefully, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They lived in rhythm with a world most others forgot existed. But even the deepest respect couldn't protect them from what was coming. The spirits may have whispered, but the soldiers came with guns, orders, and deadlines. And when the circle was broken, it didn't shatter with noise. It cracked in silence. It didn't start with screams. It started with silence, the kind of silence that falls over a town when birds stop singing, when dogs don't bark, when even the fire crackles softer, as if it knows something's wrong. In the years before removal, the Kieleji people could feel something shifting. The woods were still thick, the river still winding, but the air had changed. Messages came from other towns, of treaties signed in rooms they weren't allowed to enter, of lands divided by people who didn't understand the sacred square or the balance it held. There was no war drum, no single battle, just a slow, creeping erasure. Leaders of the Muskogee Confederacy met often, their circles longer, their silences heavier. Kieleji's elders, too, sat by the fire with furrowed brows, speaking less, watching the wind more. They could feel the pull of the future, a future made by maps, not ceremonies. And for the first time in generations, the square ground felt vulnerable. The United States government had labeled them civilized, a word that meant nothing and everything. It meant they had farms, roads, written language, but it also meant their land had become desirable. And with Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act looming over the South like a gathering storm, the Kieleji were told that cooperation would bring safety. But they knew better. A story passed quietly among the town of a grandmother who dreamed of walking west, carrying a child who never grew, of cornfields shriveling before the season turned, of a fire that refused to stay lit. These weren't just dreams. They were warnings. One morning, a messenger arrived with news from a nearby town. Their Meko had been arrested. Another town's ceremonial ground had been burned. The fire was not just symbolic anymore. It had become dangerous in the eyes of the settlers. So Kieleji prepared in their own way. They didn't run. They didn't revolt. They gathered. Elders held longer prayers. Children were taught more songs than usual. Warriors passed down secrets of the land. Where to hide, where to find healing plants, how to carry stories in case no books were left. The people didn't speak of escape. They spoke of survival through remembering. One elder, it said, buried a ceremonial rattle near the square, not out of fear, but as a promise that it would one day be unearthed by a child who still spoke the language. Others wove symbols into baskets and blankets, hiding history in patterns that no soldier would notice. And yet, beneath all of it, was grief. Fathers stood longer in the doorway before going to the fields. Mothers held their children too tightly at night. No one said it aloud, but they all knew the circle was breaking. Then came the men with paper and pens. They did not understand the town. They did not ask to sit by the fire. They came with orders, speaking in terms of relocation, tracts, agreements. But the Kieleji didn't need translations. They saw the truth in the soldiers' stiff shoulders, the eyes that never met theirs. They were being removed, not for anything they had done, but for who they were when the time came. Wagons arrived, and in the early light, Kieleji families began their long walk toward what would become Indian territory. The square ground was left behind, the fire extinguished by the wind, and the people carried only what they could: food, children. Memory. It is said that one woman carried embers from the fire in a clay jar, hidden beneath layers of cloth. Every night on the trail, she relit it, a flicker, a reminder, a defiance. Because if the fire lived, the town did too, even in exile. And so they walked, not just through forests and fields, but through the ache of becoming ghosts in their own story. The land behind them grew quiet. The square ground stood empty, but it did not vanish. It waited. The first step was not the hardest. The hardest part was realizing there was no path back. When the Kieleji were forced onto the road westward, that twisted, bitter road later called the Trail of Tears, they were not just losing land. They were losing a language of place. The hills that had heard their songs, the riverbanks where they buried stories in the soil, the trees they spoke to in prayer. None of these would walk with them. And still, they walked. Children too young to understand, mothers too tired to cry, elders too proud to beg. They walked not as warriors, but as ghosts in slow formation, carrying with them fragments of what was once whole: a sacred rattle, a bundle of tobacco leaves, a folded cloth marked with ceremonial dye, things that didn't look like much to outsiders. Along the way, names began to fade. Ceremonial towns, sacred centers that had once defined the very rhythm of Muskogee life, were lumped together, flattened into bureaucratic categories: tribes, clans, numbers. The United States government saw no difference between a warrior from Tufts and a singer from Kieleji. In their ledgers, they were all the same, but among the people, memory resisted. They whispered the name Kieleji over fires, built from unfamiliar wood. They taught it to children even as the wind tried to strip it away. And when the newcomers asked, "What tribe are you?" they answered, "We are a town. We are Kieleji, not out of arrogance, out of truth. Yet truth, too, can be rebranded. The new territory, what we now call Oklahoma, the Kieleji were given plots, borders, new rules. They rebuilt what they could, a new square ground, though it didn't feel quite the same. The air was different, the dirt to dry, but still, the fire was lit, and that meant the town lived. But now, something subtle began to shift. To gain protection, recognition, survival under U.S. law. The ceremonial towns had to become something they were never meant to be: tribes, political units, legal identities. And so, the Kieleji, Once a town that defined itself by its fire and its circle, was forced to define itself by paperwork. The name changed, not in spirit, but in structure. Kieleji tribal town. It was the price of being seen. And while some resisted, others saw it as strategy. Let them call us a tribe, one elder reportedly said, as long as they never stop calling us together. Yet even within the Muskogee Confederacy, tensions simmered. The new structure reshaped old relationships. Some ceremonial towns faded into silence. Others, like Kieleji, clung tightly to their rituals, their fire, their identity, even as outsiders dismissed them as a small remnant, a footnote. But to be small is not to be weak. The fire does not need to roar to survive. In Oklahoma, Kieleji re-established their ceremonial grounds, replanted their stories, continued their rites. Young boys were still taught to fast before entering the dance. Women still watched for omens in the trees. Dreams were still treated with respect. The snake, still a messenger, but now there was a shadow behind every ceremony. The knowledge that survival meant translating identity into legality. That the sacred had to live beside the political. That elders who once sat beside fire now sat in front of courtrooms, explaining what it meant to be a town without a town, a government without a border, a people without a map. And still, they persisted. In the dark hours before sunrise, when the drums echoed and the smoke rose again from the square, it wasn't government titles that mattered. It was rhythm, memory, connection. The same ones that had bound them in Alabama still bound them now. Because Kieleji was never just a place. It was the act of gathering, the promise of balance, the fire at the center of the soul. And though the trail changed their address and the system changed their name, it could not change their essence. They were still the people who sit together, even if they had to do it surrounded by fences and forms. And yet, even as they rebuilt in silence, another storm was brewing, not from the east this time, but from the political shadows of their own homeland. A system that would one day question whether they deserved the land under their own fire. They had survived the trail. They had rebuilt the square ground. They had relit the sacred fire with hands still shaking from exile. But in the quiet years that followed, a new danger came, one that didn't march with guns or chains, but whispered through pens, signatures, and state seals. The Kieleji tribal town had made it to Indian territory. They had adapted, renamed themselves to fit the system, and tried to live in both worlds. One ancient and ceremonial, the other modern and political. But Oklahoma, the new state rising from their shattered homeland, wasn't built to recognize fire circles and ancestral memory. It was built to forget them. In the early 1900s, as Oklahoma prepared for statehood, there was a rush to flatten identity into ownership. Who held the land? Who paid taxes? Who could be represented? Ceremonial towns like Kieleji didn't fit cleanly into this model. They weren't counties. They weren't cities. They weren't even reservations. They were cultural systems with sacred roots. So the state began to chip away. Federal officials reclassified the Kieleji as a non-federal community, not a sovereign tribe, not a full government, just a symbolic group with no formal power. Their voice was reduced to a footnote. Their square ground became private property in the eyes of the law, and their fire, the very center of their world, was treated as little more than a backyard campfire. They were told, politely, to disappear, and yet they didn't dot in dusty office buildings and rural meeting halls. Kieleji leaders pushed back. They submitted paperwork, attended hearings, and argued their right to exist not as a memory, but as a government. They didn't have a reservation, they didn't have a casino, but they had traditions, laws, a governing council, a deep connection to the land, and a right to determine their own future. It took decades. Finally, in 1941, something remarkable happened. Against all odds, the U.S. government formally acknowledged the Kieleji under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. They became a federally recognized tribal town, allowed to draft their own constitution and elect a chief, a Meko, just as they had done for generations. But recognition was not the same as power. They had no land base, no economic leverage, no major industries, and every step forward was watched by the state, by other tribes, by skeptics who thought Kieleji was too small, too obscure, too ceremonial to matter. Oklahoma, for its part, treated them as a technicality. Their documents were often delayed, their requests quietly denied, and when they attempted to assert their jurisdiction over education, over land use, over tribal rights, they were met with endless obstacles. Not chains this time, but red tape. And yet, they endured. A young generation rose, one that knew how to speak both the language of the circle and the language of the courts. They carried tribal IDs in one hand and traditional stories in the other. They weren't just preserving history, they were preparing for battle, a legal, spiritual, generational battle for the right to remain seen. Because when a state tries to erase you, survival becomes resistance. And for Kieleji, resistance meant continuing to gather. They held meetings, ceremonies, voted for leaders, filed cases, trained the next generation to speak with both reverence and strategy. They taught their children how to fast before ceremony, and how to read legal codes with the same intensity. It was a new form of war. No warriors this time, just wisdom. But even with recognition, the shadow of invisibility lingered. The Kieleji still had no reservation land, no protected territory. Their fire burned, but it burned on borrowed earth, on plots vulnerable to lawsuits and policy shifts. The state had failed to bury them, but it had succeeded in isolating them. And still, they lit the fire every year. During the summer ceremonies, they returned to the square ground. They sang the songs. They danced the steps. They greeted the morning with prayers. Because even if the world outside refused to acknowledge them, the fire did. The ancestors did. The earth, when treated properly, always remembered. But in the decades to come, that fragile recognition would be tested again. This time by a single building plan that set the town on a collision course with governments, headlines, and tribal politics alike. It began with a plan, not for a ceremony, not for a fire, but for a building. In 2011, after decades of political struggle, the Kieleji tribal town made an announcement that surprised both their allies and their critics. They intended to build a gaming center, a modest casino located on a 20-acre parcel in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, land leased by Kieleji's citizens. It was to be called Red Clay Casino. For a community that had long been marginalized, this was more than a business venture. It was a declaration: we are still here, and we have a right to prosper. The casino would bring jobs, revenue, visibility, a chance for the Kieleji to build something concrete in a world that had kept them in shadows. But the moment the news broke, so did the silence. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Local residents protested, politicians objected, even other Native groups questioned whether Kieleji had the legal standing to build. They asked, did the land truly qualify as Indian land under federal law? Did the Kieleji have jurisdiction? Were they even sovereign in that part of Oklahoma? What began as a hopeful economic project quickly turned into a legal storm. Lawsuits were filed. Injunctions were granted. Protesters picketed with signs accusing the tribe of backdoor deals. News cameras arrived, but not to tell Kieleji's story, only to capture the conflict. Most reporters didn't know the difference between Kieleji and other Muskogee towns. Many didn't care. To them, this was about a casino, not a community. But to Kieleji, it was never just about the building. It was about the right to decide their own future. Their leaders stood firm. They argued that the land was leased by tribal members, that they had proper agreements, and that the casino was within their sovereign rights. They called upon their federal recognition. They pointed to their constitution, their government structure, their long history of operating in the shadows of larger powers. But none of it seemed to matter. In 2012, after months of legal and political pressure, the U.S. government stepped in. The National Indian Gaming Commission ruled that the land was not under Kieleji jurisdiction. The project was shut down. Bulldozers sat idle. Dreams, once alive with ambition, were now buried beneath lawsuits and asphalt. The casino was never built, but the wound it left remains. For many in Kieleji, it felt like déjà vu. Another moment where the world had chosen to define them by what they weren't, instead of who they were. Not big enough, not powerful enough, not sovereign enough. A fire not worth noticing until it tried to burn a little brighter. Yet even in defeat, they learned. The fight for Red Clay Casino had exposed deep flaws in how sovereignty is measured in America. It showed how tribal towns, smaller than nations, but older than many states, often fall into legal limbo, recognized but restricted, respected in theory, but erased in practice. Still, Kieleji did what they always had. They adapted, they gathered, they kept going. After the casino battle, they turned their focus inward, strengthening youth programs, language revitalization, and ceremony. Leaders spoke of economic dreams, not just through casinos, but through cultural resilience, education, and land stewardship. The tribe refused to be defined by a failed building. Their foundation was older than concrete. Because at its core, the Kieleji story has never been about money. It's about presence, about surviving every attempt, physical, political, legal, to make them disappear. And while the casino may never rise, the fire still does. But behind the lawsuits and headlines, another truth flickered in the embers. That the strength of Kieleji does not only lie in its leaders or its courts. It lies in the quiet power of its women, the carriers of tradition, of food, of songs, of silence. Before a single drumbeat echoes through the square ground, it is a woman who lays the food upon the cloth. Before a boy dances his first step. In ceremony, it is a grandmother who fastens the beads to his sash. And when the fire is lit, not just with wood, but with prayer, it is a mother who whispers to the smoke, asking it to carry the names of her ancestors. In Kieleji life, women are the keepers of rhythm. They are not loud, they do not demand, but their presence shapes everything. In a world defined by balance between sky and earth, spirit and body, man and woman, the Kieleji women form the silent core that holds the town steady. They are not behind the fire, they are beside it. Though colonial systems often portrayed native women as voiceless or submissive, Kieleji tradition tells a different story. Here, women carried ceremonial authority, especially over the home, over food, over spiritual boundaries. They knew the rules of the garden, the signs in the wind, the right songs to sing when the sky darkened before harvest. A woman who understood the land could feed a town without ever raising her voice. Marriage, too, followed unique rhythms. While political alliances were shaped through male leadership, the harmony of daily life was orchestrated by wives, mothers, and aunts. They enforced taboos with calm certainty. They oversaw the moral health of the family. If a husband lost balance, to jealousy, to anger, it was the wife who reminded him of the ceremony in silence and stillness. Not control, but correction. And they were watchers of dreams. It was often the elder women, those who had seen many seasons, who interpreted dreams for the young. A child who woke crying was soothed with lullabies that doubled as spiritual instructions. A daughter who dreamed of snakes was gently asked what she had kept hidden. Women spoke to the fire differently, not to command it, but to understand it. During times of removal, when homes were left behind and rivers became memories, the women carried the invisible things, stories wrapped in cloth, recipes without, measurements, the sound of a lullaby sung over the rattling wheels of wagons headed west. Even as the town was torn from its roots, the women folded the culture into their hands and carried it forward. They still do. In present day Kieleji life, it is often the women who run the language classes, who lead community events, who braid ceremonial outfits late at night, sewing old symbols into modern cloth. They may not hold the title of Mecca, but they hold the weight of continuity. You'll see them at the edge of the square ground, sitting in folding chairs, watching as boys relearn dances and girls pass food between families. They correct gently, laugh often, listen deeply, and when they speak, the town leans closer. Because to lose the voice of a Kieleji woman is to lose a thread in the ceremonial web. In a world that has tried again and again to silence them, through policy, through poverty, through historical erasure, the women of Kieleji have kept the fire alive in the most human way, by feeding it with memory, song, and care. They are the hands beneath the drum, the silence before the prayer, the keepers of what cannot be rewritten. And it is through their quiet strength that the next generation rises, learning not just what it means to be Kieleji, but what it means to stay Kieleji. A boy wakes before the sun. His grandmother hands him a small wooden bowl, carved years before he was born. They don't speak. They don't need to. The ceremony begins not with a chant, but with quiet, inherited motion. Across the Kieleji community, children grow up not just with last names, but with roles. Some will carry water to the square ground. Some will learn the songs that echo only in ceremony. Others will be dreamers, watchers, keepers of silent things. Not every child understands right away, but over time, the fire finds them. This isn't a culture of sermons or classrooms. It's a culture of gestures, passed like secrets. How to step with rhythm on the red dirt. How to dip your fingers into cornmeal before prayer. How to tell the difference between a mockingbird's warning and its play. Elders know that stories alone can't keep a culture alive. They must be lived so they teach by doing. A teenage girl helps prepare the ceremonial feast, not knowing her every move is being watched by little cousins who will one day copy her hands. A young boy, quiet and unsure, is called to carry firewood to the circle, not because he's ready, but because someone must choose him before he believes in himself. These are not accidental lessons. They are small AWAKENINGS. And yet, the children are growing up into worlds. At school. They are taught American history that rarely includes them. They raise their hands under fluorescent lights to correct mispronunciations of their heritage. They read textbooks that mention creeks like they're long gone. Then they return home to stories in Muskogee, to a square ground that still breathes, to elders who remind them that they are the stories still being written. It's not always easy. Some children drift. Some struggle to understand why these rituals matter when the world outside offers distractions louder and shinier. And yet, when summer comes, and the grass around the ceremonial ground is cleared, they return, sometimes unsure, but always welcome. Because the Kieleji don't expect perfection. They expect presence. There is a boy, maybe 12, who forgot the words to the corn song during his first ceremony. His cheeks burned red. The drums paused. An elder stepped forward and began singing gently, not to correct him, but to carry him forward. That is how fire is passed, not through speeches, through trust. Today, efforts to teach Muskogee language are growing. Elders record songs on old cassette players. Children repeat them with headphones on, the old words wrapped in modern sounds. Some carry apps in their pockets now, little windows back, into a time when language danced on every breeze. Still, the square ground remains the most powerful classroom, because no device can replicate the feeling of standing barefoot in the dust, watching the smoke rise, knowing that your breath joins the breath of your great-grandparents, that the air is older than any book could describe. The children who inherit the fire don't do so by accident. They are watched, chosen, guided, and when they take their place in the circle, even if only for a moment, the town breathes easier. For as long as there are young hands to carry wood, as long as there are small voices to sing the first lines, even shakily, the fire will not go out. Try to find it on a map. You'll scroll past Tulsa, past Broken Arrow, past the ribbons of highway that cut through eastern Oklahoma like careless scars. You'll search for borders, for a reservation line, for the word Kieleji stamped onto a county grid, but you won't find it. Because Kieleji is not a place you can pin down. It's a fire that refuses to be drawn in pencil. Unlike many other federally recognized tribes, the Kieleji tribal town has no land base, no formal reservation, no centralized capital. Their ceremonial ground exists, real, sacred, fiercely protected, but it does not sit on federally designated trust land. Instead, it's woven into plots held by individual members, hidden in plain sight among the trees and quiet roads. This is not a failure. This is survival by adaptation. In the decades since removal, since forced transformation into a political entity, the Kieleji have learned to live without being seen. They hold council meetings in buildings leased or borrowed. They conduct ceremonies on ground not always recognized by the federal government, but known in their hearts. They operate in the cracks between visibility and invisibility, a sovereign town with no fixed address. To outsiders, this can be confusing. How can a people exist without a home base? But to the Kieleji, that question misses the point. They are not defined by lines. They are defined by gathering. The fire burns not because of where it sits, but because people still come to sit around it. Still, the challenges are real. Without a reservation, the Kieleji must navigate endless complications, jurisdictional confusion, limited funding, misclassification. Federal grants that prioritize land-based tribes often overlook them. Legal protections that apply to larger, territorially structured nations can fall short. And yet, they persist. Young leaders draw strength not from maps, but from elders who remind them that Kieleji has never been about buildings. It has always been about practice, about relationship. When a grandmother calls her grandchildren into the kitchen and teaches them how to grind corn for the summer ceremony, that's Kieleji. When a young man folds his ribbon shirt and lays it out with care the night before the green corn dance, that's Kieleji. When a family drives 3 hours to reach the square ground, knowing they'll leave with dusty feet and full hearts, that's Kieleji, too. This is a town of spirit, not streets. There are elders who carry maps inside them, not drawn in ink, but in story. They point to a bend in a river, a tree that leans east, a patch of earth that once held a council house. They remember how the wind sounds when it passes over old ground. They know when to stop talking and start listening. For them, Kieleji has never been lost. It's just waiting to be remembered. In recent years, efforts have grown to reconnect the scattered pieces. Digital archives, oral history projects, land use initiatives. Community members host gatherings not just for ceremony, but for conversation, to stitch the invisible fabric tighter again. Because even if there's no official marker on the highway, the soul of the town is very much alive. It lives in the songs sung softly in kitchens, in the laughter of children running barefoot in summer heat, in the way a Meko pauses before speaking, not for effect, but out of respect for the silence that came before him. So no, you won't find Kieleji on a map, but you'll find it in the rhythm of breath shared in ceremony, in the refusal to be erased, in the fire that keeps burning, not because of government validation, but because enough people believe it still matters. And as the smoke rises from the square ground, invisible to satellites but clear as day to the people who gather, we come to understand a town is not always a place. Sometimes it's a promise. It begins again, as it always does. Just before the sun climbs over the trees, the air is still. You can hear your own breath, and then the sound of footsteps on red dirt. A voice, low and steady, speaks in Muskogee. Hands reach for the kindling, eyes close in prayer. The fire is lit. Not for warmth, not for light, but because this fire is the heartbeat of Kieleji. Through centuries of change, betrayal, removal, and resistance, the fire has remained, flickering but never fading. It has been carried in clay pots across trails of exile, protected during wars of erasure, buried in the hearts of children who barely understood its weight. And still, it lives. This chapter isn't about the past. It's about what endures. In the present day, the Kieleji tribal town may not own vast lands or operate a sprawling economy. They may not appear in headlines or school textbooks, but among the ceremonial grounds, in the moments between dusk and dawn, something ancient is still happening. A fire is being fed, and with it, identity, memory, language, and faith. There is no press release when the summer ceremony begins. No cameras, no hashtags, just people gathering, folding chairs lined in humble rows, grandmothers carrying bowls wrapped in cloth, teenagers trying to remember the order of the dances, a Meko watching, saying little, measuring the mood of the wind around the fire. The square ground reawakens. Songs rise, low, rhythmic, full of syllables that predate borders. Children listen with wide eyes. Elders sing with tired voices, not because they can, but because they must. Each syllable is a stitch in a fabric that once tore, but never unraveled. They remember. They remember the towns that vanished on the trail of tears. They remember the red clay casino, the dream that never stood, but revealed so much. They remember the state's attempt to bury them, not in earth, but in paperwork. And they remember that they are still here. Here, sovereignty doesn't wear a suit or speak in courtrooms. It wears moccasins and smells of wood smoke. It speaks in gesture, in silence, in shared memory. Even now, in the modern world, the Kieleji are innovating, teaching language through technology, using digital archives to preserve oral history, building spaces of learning and gathering where their youth can grow both proud and rooted. They are not frozen in time. They are moving forward while walking backward, honoring what was to protect what's to come. Because survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about keeping the fire lit. A young boy places another log on the flame. He glances at his uncle, waiting for approval. He receives a nod, a small one, but enough He doesn't know all the songs yet, but he knows this. The fire matters, and he matters, because he's part of the reason it still burns. This is what the ancestors hoped for. Not monuments, not headlines, just another sunrise where the people gather, the songs rise, and the fire holds steady. Kieleji is not a story of loss. It is a story of persistence, of a ceremonial town that refused to become a footnote, of a people who survived not by becoming invisible, but by staying unmistakably themselves, even when the world forgot to look. So when you think of native survival, remember this. It doesn't always shout. It doesn't always fight with fists. Sometimes it simply continues through soft footsteps, sacred rhythms, and a fire that has never asked permission to burn. And if you ever happen to find yourself near Tulsa on a summer night and you see smoke curling above the trees, listen closely. That's not just wood burning. That's history, ceremony, and spirit refusing to die. Because the fire never went out. It was carried, protected, remembered, and today, against all odds, in a world that tried to forget it, the fire is still lit. The people still sit together, and Kieleji still lives. In the deep pine forests along the shores of a lake whose name means old clearing, a tribe once vanished from U.S. treaties for 150 years, but never from their homeland. They are the Lac View Desert Band of Chippewa, guardians of sacred water, prophecy, and stories whispered by ancestors through birch bark scrolls and northern winds. Today, they've reclaimed their sovereignty, not with weapons, but with memory, defiance, and fire still burning beside frozen lakes. This is not a tragedy. This is a return. Long before this place was called Michigan, before borders were carved and roads were paved, there was a lake tucked deep in the pines. The water shimmered like a mirror between worlds. Mist would rise from its still surface at dawn, as if the earth itself was whispering secrets to the sky. This was not just any lake. It was Lac View Desert, the old clearing, and here spirits walked without fear. The people who came to this place did not arrive by accident. They followed visions, omens, and prophecy. The Anishinaabe ancestors had left their eastern homelands generations earlier, guided by a sacred message, to move west until they reached the land where food grows on water. That food was wild rice, and that land was this lake, rich, remote, alive with voice. The journey was not quick. It stretched across decades, across rivers, across generations. Along the way, clans carried with them stories written not on paper, but on birch bark scrolls, carefully etched with sacred symbols that could only be read by those initiated in the Midewiwin, the Grand Medicine Society. These weren't just songs or prayers. They were blueprints of being. When the people reached this clearing, they knew they had found the place of prophecy, not just because the wild rice swayed in the shallows, but because the dreams began to change. The elders felt it. The children felt it. The animals moved differently. The forest watched. This land was old, older than memory, older than names, and the Anishinaabe who settled here didn't try to own it. They listened to it. They built their wigwams near the water's edge, shaping them from saplings and bark. Fires were lit carefully, with offerings of tobacco. Stories were told at night. Stories passed from mouth to mouth like soft embers in the dark. Spirits weren't just believed in. They were part of the family. The water held more than fish, it held truth. Dreams were interpreted by the shoreline. Songs were taught on canoes. Children learned that certain rocks had names, certain birds carried messages, and certain winds could only blow during morning. This was the world of the Lac View Desert, bound before the borders came. But even in those early days, they understood time moved in circles, not lines. Seasons returned, lives returned, even pain returned, though not yet. For now, there was harmony between people and land, body and dream, fire and memory. They were not a large tribe. They did not build walls, but they were rooted in something. Deeper than territory, they were rooted in relationship with the lake, with the sky, and with each other. To this day, the people of Lac View Desert say the spirits still speak at dawn, sometimes in the sound of loons, sometimes in the frost that forms like fingers on the birch, sometimes in dreams that feel too heavy to forget. It is here, in this sacred clearing, that the story begins, not with conquest or war, but with a quiet arrival and a promise kept, a promise to protect the place where food grows on water, a promise to honor the spirits that waited in the mist, a promise to keep walking the path of prophecy, no matter what comes next. Because in the Anishinaabe world, the past is never behind you, it's beside you, walking. And just beyond the pines, behind the whispering lake, lies the deeper heart of their survival, a spiritual order known only to those who dream with their eyes open and heal with words older than stone. At the edge of the village, tucked behind a curtain of pines, stands a lodge that doesn't look like much, made of bent saplings and thick bark. It breathes with the earth. No windows, no nails, just a small door facing east, toward the rising sun, toward renewal. This is the Nativeamerican Lodge, and what happens inside isn't easily explained. It isn't performance. It isn't spectacle. It is ceremony, sacred medicine, and memory alive in motion. The Nativeamerican, known as the Grand Medicine Society, is more than a religion. It is a way of knowing, a way of healing, a sacred system passed through bloodlines, visions, and carefully guarded ritual. For the Lac View Desert Band, it is the core of who they are, not an accessory to culture, but the very fire that kept them alive through centuries of erasure. Here, in this lodge, the air is thick with cedar smoke and songs. Older than empire, men and women who have trained for years, sometimes decades, gather to perform rites that align the spirit, body, and the land around them. The drum doesn't just keep time. It calls forward the ancestors. The songs, sung in Anasazi, aren't just melodies. They are codes, healing prayers, laws. Inside, sacred items are brought out one by one. A turtle shell rattle, a staff etched with clan symbols, a birch bark scroll curled tightly like the memory of a dream. These scrolls, handed down across generations, are filled with pictographs, drawn symbols that speak of birth, medicine, prophecy, and the long journey west. They tell the story of the 7 fires, the sacred migration, the arrival at Lac View Desert, and the things that are still to come. To become mine is to walk with great responsibility. You cannot lie. You cannot take life without cause. You must live in balance, in humility. Young initiates often fast for days, alone in the woods, listening for their spirit helper, an animal or force that will walk with them through life. For some it is the bear, the healer. For others, the loon, the messenger. Each relationship is personal, each story sacred. This chapter of life isn't rushed. It unfolds slowly, with care. A healer may wait many winters before being taught a single song. They must prove themselves through patience, compassion, and dreams. In Midwewin, wisdom is not shouted. It is waited for. The medicine itself is both physical and spiritual. Cedar, sage, sweetgrass, and tobacco, the 4 sacred medicines, are used not just to cure illness, but to cleanse spaces, call in spirits, and restore harmony. Illness is not always seen as a defect. Sometimes it is a message, a warning, that something is unbalanced in the body or in the world. And so, ceremonies are held quietly, carefully. People sit in a circle, hearts open, eyes closed. They pass tobacco. They speak names aloud, not to gossip, but to ask for protection. They call on the spirits of those who've gone before, and those yet to come. And always, at the center, burns a small fire. That fire is everything. It is the heart of the lodge, the breath of the ancestors, the symbol of unbroken knowing. It flickers with intention. It does not roar. It listens. Even today, Midwewin survives in secret places, in remote clearings, in the minds of those who protect it like a flame in the wind. It survived removal. It survived boarding schools. It survived laws that once made its very existence illegal. And yet, it lives, not for tourists, not for textbooks, but for those who still dream the old dreams and walk the old paths. In the Lac View Desert Band, the Midwewin is still passed down. Young people, skeptical at first, find themselves pulled into the circle, drawn by the calm, by the mystery, by the truth they feel but cannot name. And when they step inside the lodge, kneel before the fire, and hear the drum begin to speak, they remember who they are. This is not a story of spiritual revival. It is a story of spiritual refusal to die. Because in the Anishinaabe world, you are never far from spirit. You carry it in your chest, in your tongue, in the shape of your shadow, when you stand still long enough to listen. The Midwewin is the language of survival, the archive of soul, and for the people of Lac View Desert, it is proof that what was once whispered in birch and blood still holds the power to heal. What this world forgets. The trees here are not decorations. They are pillars, guardians, teachers. Towering red pines and thick birch trunks cradle the land where the Lac View Desert Band made their lives long, before roads cut through the soil. Beneath this evergreen ceiling, daily life moved with the rhythm of the seasons, not the ticking of clocks. In summer, wigwams rose near the lake's edge, dome shelters made from willow frames and birch bark, cool in the heat, sturdy against the rain. Families gathered in small camps. Children splashed in the shallows while women smoked fish, and men shaped tools from stone and bone. Laughter mixed with the sizzle of firewood. Everything had purpose. Nothing was wasted. When the rice ripened, they moved again. Canoes slid through the shallows like whispers. With long cedar sticks, they gently bent the rice stalks into the boat and tapped them. Tap, tap, letting the grains fall without breaking the plant. This wasn't just harvest. It was ceremony. Wild rice, or manumin, was not a crop. It was a gift. The food that had been promised in prophecy. In autumn, they shifted inland, deeper into the forest. Time for hunting. Moose, deer, rabbit, all taken with care, all honored in spirit. Nothing was done casually. Before each hunt, prayers were offered, tobacco laid down, and promises made. A single kill could feed a family for weeks. The bones would be used for tools, the sinew for thread, the hide for warmth. In every part of life, gratitude was the currency. Winter came slowly, then all at once, blanketing the land in deep silence. Camps moved again, this time to higher ground, sheltered from winds. Fires burned steady inside wigwams. It was a time of stories. Elders would gather children close and speak of Sky Woman, of the giant beaver who once ruled the lakes, of the trickster Nanabozo who taught hard lessons through foolish acts. These weren't just tales. They were moral maps, spoken so the soul would remember when the mind forgot. Marriage and family were woven through clan law. Each person belonged to a dukedom, a clan like bear, crane, or fish, each with roles, responsibilities, and sacred meanings. Marrying within one's clan was forbidden, not by force, but by spiritual agreement. Families were often matrilineal, with women holding deep influence over home and children, while men carried responsibility for hunting, protection, and counsel. But decisions weren't made by dominance. They were made through listening, in slow circles, by firelight, where silence was respected more than shouting. Everyone had a voice. Everyone had a role. Harmony was not a luxury. It was survival. There were no written laws, but there were rules. Don't take more than you need. Don't speak when you should be listening. Don't forget your dreams. They carry truth. And most of all, don't ever disrespect the land. Because the land remembers. Every day beneath these trees was filled with motion, skinning hides, gathering bark for baskets, boiling maple sap in springtime snow. Children learned by watching, by mimicking, by being included. No lectures, just life. And when a child laughed or cried, the forest answered. The world was not separate from the people. It was the people, the animals, the wind, the stars, all relatives, all carrying messages if you listened with your spirit, not just your ears. This is what life looked like before it was called history. Not primitive, not picturesque, just alive, just whole. And even now, when you walk these woods at dusk, you can almost hear it. The rhythm of a birch bark flap opening, the hiss of cedar smoke, the voice of a grandmother telling a story her grandmother told before her. But not every part of life was soft. Some dreams were warnings. Some rituals strange, some losses unbearable. She hadn't spoken his name since the ice melted. The winter had taken her boy quietly, without cruelty, without sound. One day he was there, curled beside the fire with his breath rising like smoke. The next, he was still, and the pines outside didn't shake, and the lake didn't scream. The world kept going, but she did not. Her name was Awanakor, and she was known among the Lackview Desert Band as a woman who dreamed in layers. Not just the kind of dreams you forget by sunrise, but dreams that stuck, that came back in symbols, in smells, in the call of birds at wrong hours. She was not Maid, but she carried something close to it, an intuition, a knowing when her son died. No ceremony made the pain smaller. No tobacco calmed her hands. She wandered into the forest the way her grandmother had taught her not to escape, but to listen. For 3 days, she ate nothing but snow. She slept beneath a lean-to of pine boughs, and on the second night, it came, the dream. She stood in a clearing of ash trees, the world bathed in deep blue light. A bear stood before her, not threatening, not tame, just there. Its fur was matted with riverweed, its eyes gold and patient. It did not speak, but she understood. It had come for her grief. In Anishinaabe belief, the bear is the healer, the protector, the one who walks between life and the spirit world without fear. The Bear Clan once guided medicine and law. To dream of one, especially after loss, meant the spirits were offering a path, but not an easy one. Awanakor followed the bear in her dream through woods she didn't know, past faces carved into trees, past children laughing without mouths. She didn't ask questions. She only watched. When she awoke, her body was cold, but her chest no longer felt hollow. She gathered pine needles and placed them in a pouch beside her son's old moccasins. She returned home and said nothing. But that night she sang, not loudly, not with words, just a hum, barely a breath, while stirring soup. And slowly, the women of the village began to notice. She had returned, not the same, not healed, but rethreaded. And from then on, when a child was born ill, or when someone began having dreams that felt too heavy, Awanakor was called, not as a healer, as a listener. She never spoke of the dream in detail, but she told the young ones this: if a bear comes to you in sleep, do not run. If it opens its mouth, do not speak. If it leaves, do not follow. Just let it see what you carry. Bears come when we hold things too tightly. These are not just stories. They are survival woven through sorrow. Among the Lackview Desert people, dreams are not decoration. They are direction. A snake in the grass may be a warning. A tree falling in a silent forest may be a message. A bear in a dream may be a door. Awanakor lived many winters after that, always walking a little slower, always watching the wind. Her son's name was never spoken aloud again, not because she forgot, but because he had become part of the forest, part of the water, part of the bear. And to this day, some say when the mist rolls off Lackview Desert in the morning, you can see the shape of a great bear moving just beneath the surface. Not a ghost, not a spirit, just grief that chose not to leave, but to guide. Because in this tribe, pain is not buried. It is carried, honored, dreamed through. But dreams alone couldn't protect them from what came next. The world outside was waking up, not with curiosity, but with conquest. And even the birch bark scrolls, sacred as they were, could not shield the Lac-View Desert Band from the betrayal that would erase them from paper, but never from land. There was a time when knowledge didn't live in books. It lived in the curves of a birch tree. The Lac-View Desert Band, like other Anishinaabe people, held their sacred knowledge on Weequasaback, birch bark scrolls. They weren't just for storytelling. These scrolls held medicine songs, clan laws, creation myths, and dream symbols that couldn't be spoken outside this sacred lodge. Some were tiny as a hand, others stretched out like a spine of memory. To the untrained eye, they looked like scratched lines and crooked dots. But to the initiated, they were maps of spirit. The scrolls belonged to the Midewiwin, the Grand Medicine Society, and they were passed down not just by hands, but by ceremony. A young initiate might study a single line for years before being told its full meaning. This secrecy wasn't to exclude, it was to protect. Because what is sacred must be shielded from those who seek only to own it. But then came the treaties. Paper, ink, promises, lies. In 1842, 1847, 1854, one after another, treaties were signed between the U.S. government and various Ojibwe bands across what is now Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Signatures were scrawled beneath language that the people could not read. In rooms filled with smoke and pressure, translations were rushed, interpretations twisted, and some of the signers weren't even the proper leaders. Some weren't even Ojibwe. The Lac-View Desert Band was never consulted directly. They weren't the ones with the loudest voices or the largest land, but their future was still rewritten. A people with no paper, no pen, and no lawyer were placed under a treaty they never truly agreed to. And so, with the stroke of a foreign quill, their homeland became a territory. Their hunting rights became a privilege. Their very identity became something that could be listed or erased. And yet, the scrolls remained. When government agents came, they saw only wood and smoke and silence. They didn't see the scrolls hidden under mats. They didn't hear the whispered Maid songs passed at dusk. The Lac-View Desert Band hid their knowledge in plain sight, where only those with spirit sight could find it. There's a story told by elders that one old Midewiwin priest, when he heard the treaties had been signed, walked out to the lake with a birch scroll tucked under his shirt. He held it to the wind, then buried it in the reeds, whispering, "When paper fails us, spirit will not." The scroll was never found again. Maybe it dissolved into the lake bed. Maybe it waits. But even as the official maps erased their name, the knowledge on those scrolls continued, carried in memory, in breath, in bone. What followed were decades of quiet resistance. Lac-View Desert was lumped in with other bands, treated as legally invisible. The U.S. said they didn't exist as a separate tribe, and yet their ceremonies never stopped. Their dreams never changed. The people still gathered, still harvested. Rice still whispered the old names into the pine air dot in school. Children were taught to forget. In churches, they were told their scrolls were evil. In government offices, they were told their identity was too complicated to recognize. But in the forest, under the birch trees, the lines remained, because what colonization couldn't understand, it also couldn't destroy. The people who traced their truth in bark and wind did not need permission to be real. And yet the betrayal left scars, scars still felt in bloodlines, still seen in lawsuits and courtrooms today. The sacred scrolls that once mapped spirit now sit in museums, some taken, some donated under pressure, labeled with glass and white tags that call them artifacts. But they are not art. They are living. They hum in the presence of those who know their rhythm. To betray a people is one thing, but to deny they ever existed on their own, that is a deeper crime. And the Lakeview Desert Band, once invisible, on paper, would spend over a century fighting to be seen again. Not for recognition, but for restoration, because they never disappeared. They were just not looking where the government was looking. So they sharpened their memory, they held their ceremonies, they buried their scrolls in blood and breath, and waited for a time when the truth could be spoken again, not in courtrooms, but in canoes, by the fire, in the voice of a grandmother speaking softly over boiling rice. But the cost of that silence and the fight to undo it would not stay hidden forever. Imagine waking up one day and being told you don't exist. Not that you've died, not that you've moved, but that you were never really there to begin with. No name in the registry, no recognition in the law, no mention in the history books, just a faint echo between pages. That was the reality for the Lakeview Desert Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, from 1850 for onward. After a series of blurred treaties and legal backroom deals, the Lakeview Desert Band vanished. Not from the earth, not from their sacred lands, but from official records. The United States government chose to treat them not as a sovereign people with their own language, culture, and governance, but as a footnote beneath a larger name, the Queen Obey Indian community. The logic was chilling. They're small, they said. They don't need separate recognition. But that word, recognition, meant everything. Without it, there were no federal protections, no funding, no formal say in hunting, land rights, education, or sovereignty. They were present, but legally invisible. And still, they stayed. They raised children under pine rafters and star-stitched skies. They sang Midwewin songs in secret rooms and kept scrolls tucked in cedar chests. They fished the lakes that once named them, harvested rice from waters that refused to forget them. But the outside world did forget. For 150 years, they lived in the shadow of others' names, their stories mistaken, misfiled, or erased. Elders tell of community meetings held by lantern light, where young parents asked how to register births when there was no tribe name to write on the form, how to teach children they were part of something sacred when every government document said otherwise, how to carry pride when the law said you were borrowed people, temporarily acknowledged under someone else's title. But Lakeview Desert was not borrowed. It was born in 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act gave tribes a chance to govern themselves again. The Lac-Vieux Desert Band tried to stand up, but no one at the Bureau of Indian Affairs wanted to listen. You're already represented. They were told, Queen Obey speaks for you. But the people knew the truth. No one speaks for you if they've never sat at your fires. It would take decades of persistence, patience, and paperwork. Men and women who never wore suits stepped into courtrooms. Grandmothers brought family trees, land deeds, faded photographs. They built a case with the kind of evidence no government could truly understand. The kind passed through lullabies and remembered in sweat lodge smoke. And then, in 1988, the impossible happened. President Ronald Reagan signed Public Law 100-420. The Lac-Vieux Desert Band was restored as a federally recognized tribe. After 134 years of being lost on paper, but never in soul. It was not a favor. It was not a gift. It was a correction of history. Recognition didn't erase the pain, but it gave them tools to govern their own affairs, to protect their language, to care for their people, to build again. Still, the scars of that long silence remain. Some families grew apart. Some knowledge was lost in the cracks. Some old songs were never sung again. But the fire remained. And so, this story isn't just about injustice. It's about returning without asking permission. About waking from a 150-year erasure and remembering your name before they forgot it for you. Today, the Lac-Vieux Desert Band runs its own tribal government, its own health clinic, its own community programs. It's a long road ahead, but the trail no longer fades behind them. Because to truly understand the pain of being made invisible, you must understand the strength it takes to still be seen and to still speak. When no one believed you had a voice, and while some might, see 1988 as the end of a fight for the people of Lac-Vieux Desert. It was something else, but even with recognition, the tribe would still face battles over casinos, over sovereignty, over the right to build something for themselves. Without the constant whisper of government interference, it began with a building, simple, modest. Barely a whisper compared to the neon giants downstate. But in the quiet northwoods of Michigan, surrounded by pine trees and icy lakes, that little structure meant something bigger. It wasn't just a casino, it was proof. For the Lac-Vieux Desert Band, federal recognition in 1988 wasn't just a piece of legislation, it was a second birth. But recognition without resources is like a canoe with no paddle. What came next wasn't just celebration. It was planning, pressure, and the urgency of generations waiting to be heard. So the people gathered, and they asked a bold question. What if we built something for ourselves, with our own hands, on our own land? In 1992, they did just that. The Northern Waters Casino Resort opened its doors near Watersmeet, Michigan, a place sacred for centuries, now shining with a new kind of fire. It wasn't Vegas, it wasn't flashy, but it was sovereign. And for a community told for 150 years that they didn't exist. Ownership was everything. The casino wasn't just about games. It was survival, a way to fund health care, housing, education, and cultural programs. A way to lift elders out of poverty, to bring jobs back to the reservation, to feed the spirit and the body. But the flames of independence rarely burn without resistance. The moment the casino lit its neon sign, opponents gathered like moths. Competing interests from nearby towns and political forces began whispering, should they be allowed? Will it ruin the area? Can they even run it properly? The questions weren't about business. They were about control. And yet, the Lac-View Desert Band pressed on. They built schools, paid for medicine, reinvested in their own. Revenue from the casino helped fund programs to preserve the Ojibwe language and restore traditional crafts. For the first time in decades, young people had a reason to stay. But just as the casino gave, it was also dragged into one of the most important legal battles in tribal economic history. In the late 1990s, the band sued the state of Michigan, not for money, but for rights, specifically the right to operate video pull-tab machines without unnecessary state interference. The case climbed, wound its way through legal forests, and finally reached the Supreme Court under Lac-View Desert. Band v. Michigan Gaming Control Board. At the core of it, one explosive truth, even with recognition. The tribe still had to fight to prove they deserved the benefits of being sovereign. The ruling helped shape the conversation around tribal gaming. Across the country, it drew a line in the sand between what states could demand and what tribes were owed. But more than that, it showed the world that this tiny, often overlooked community wasn't just playing games. They were rewriting the rules. Some call casinos controversial, but for the Lac-View Desert Band, theirs was a torch passed through time, a way to reclaim what had been denied through policy, erased through paperwork, and dismissed by ignorance. And if you drive through Watersmeet today, you'll still see it. That same casino, its lights glowing like a beacon against the cold pine dusk. People come and go, locals, tourists, tribal members. But beneath the games, the flashing lights, and the shuffle of cards, a different kind of ceremony happens. Elders funded by the revenue pass on stories in classrooms. Single mothers are able to feed their children. A young boy hears Ojibwe spoken, aloud for the first time in his life, not in secret, but in school, all because of a building that critics once called a gamble. But the truth, it wasn't a gamble. It was a declaration that the Lac-View Desert Band is not a relic, not a forgotten people, but a sovereign nation with the right to decide how it thrives. And in many ways, that casino lit more than a fire. It lit a path forward, one paved with determination, law, and legacy. Yet even as the lights glowed and lawsuits closed, another challenge loomed. How to keep the soul of the people alive, not just the economy, not just the politics, but the heartbeat that began long before paperwork and neon signs. The Lac-View Desert Band does not just live by the water. They are the water. For centuries, their lives have pulsed with the rhythm of lakes, rivers, and the ancient veins of the earth. Before there were roads or fences or even maps, there was water, and it told the people where to go, when to gather, how to heal, and when to listen. The wild rice that grows across the shallows is not just food. It's prophecy made edible. In their origin stories, water is not scenery. It's a being, alive with mood and memory. Elders speak of rivers as if they're relatives. They pour tobacco into the lake not as ritual, but as conversation. And when someone falls ill, the cure is often found not in a pill, but in a spring, a root near the shore, or a quiet moment under cedar trees by the current's edge. This is why the Lac Vieux Desert Band was never surprised when the battles of the 21st century came not just over land, but over water rights. What shocked others? Pipelines, pollution, government neglect. The tribe had seen coming for generations. They knew the danger of treating water like a resource instead of a relative. And so, when water was threatened, they stood, they joined. Lawsuits. They marched with other Anishinaabe bands. They stood in solidarity with Standing Rock, their flags flying alongside thousands of others in the bitter cold. But their battle was not just about oil. It was about memory, because these were not new threats. They were old wounds reopened, echoes of the time when colonizers poisoned rivers to starve tribes, when treaties were signed to strip away fishing rights, when nets were burned and boats were seized. Yet through it all, the Lac Vieux Desert Band kept returning to the water. Children were taught how to rise, how to move gently so as not to bruise the stalks. Youth ceremonies began at the lakeshore, where dreams were whispered into waves, and the Nativeamerican, the Sacred Medicine Society, continued to speak of Nibi water as a living spirit that flows through body and land alike. In 2020, the band took a major step. They created a water resources department with trained scientists, tribal monitors, and traditional knowledge keepers working side by side. Together, they tracked lake health, fought invasive species, and protected wild rice beds with data and song. This blend of satellite imagery and cedar smudge, of biology and belief, is what makes them different. They don't draw lines between science and spirituality. They understand that one can't function without the other. But even as they protect their own waters, they keep one eye on the future, on threats from beyond the reservation, from climate change, from corporations that see fresh water as a commodity instead of a covenant. And yet, they do not speak in panic. They speak with legacy, because their bloodline is made of river water and snowmelt, of fog and sweat and silent paddles. Through dawn mist, they've survived without pipelines. They've survived beyond dams. They've survived despite being told over and over again that they were too small to fight back. But water teaches persistence. It carves through rock. It finds a way. So do the Lac Vieux Desert people. They've even begun training a new generation of young water protectors, kids who know how to code water sensors and how to sing to the lake. Kids who understand that activism is not always shouting. Sometimes it's gathering rice respectfully, or refusing to sell shoreline, or keeping watch on policies written by men who've never tasted lake wind on their tongues. This chapter, this movement, is not a reaction. It is a return to balance, to belief, to the understanding that water, like memory, must be protected from forgetting. And so the tribe continues to guard what the earth gives freely, not because they fear loss, but because they remember how it feels to have nothing left to protect. As pipelines creep closer and headlines drift away, the Lac View Desert Band remains a living, flowing resistance. And while the water holds memory, it also holds names. Names nearly lost. Names whispered through generations. Names that once disappeared for 150 years, and yet somehow still survived. The stars have Ojibwe names, long before telescopes and textbooks. The night sky was not a mystery, it was a storybook. The people of the Lac View Desert Band didn't just look up, they listened. Each cluster, each wandering light, each flicker had a meaning. The constellations weren't just there to admire. They were teachers, trackers, reminders, and the language they spoke was Anasazi. But something happened quietly, brutally, invisibly, over the course of just a few generations. The words began to slip, not in battle, not through fire, but through silence. Classrooms punished it, churches banned it, parents, trying to protect their children from being beaten or mocked, stopped speaking it aloud. And so, the stars grew nameless. The loss wasn't just of grammar or vocabulary. It was the loss of worldview. In Anasazi, time moves in circles, not lines. There is no word for ownership in the way the West defines it. Even verbs shift depending on whether the subject is animate or inanimate, because trees, rocks, rivers, and dreams are all alive. The English language couldn't hold these truths. It flattened them. And so, the old meanings began to vanish, not because they weren't needed, but because they were no longer welcomed. But language, like water, remembers its shape. In the early 2000s, something sparked. Elders, many in their final years, began speaking again, quietly, gently, as if waking up an animal that had been sleeping too long. They taught words like Jiwadin, north wind, Nibi, water, and Wawash Kishi, deer. They told children that the moon had a name, Debenjigan, and that it was female. They didn't teach it in schools first. They taught it in kitchens, around fires, in story circles, in whispered corrections when a child said snow in English, and an elder smiled and said, Ziguan. Then came the programs, language revitalization efforts funded by the casino, immersion schools, apps, audio archives. Tribal youth began writing poems in Ojibwe again. Some even rapped in it, blending old rhythm with new breath. Grandmothers watched, quietly proud, as their grandsons began speaking sentences they once had to bury. The Lac View Desert Band was reclaiming something far more powerful than policy. They were reclaiming the logic of the stars, because to speak Anasazi isn't just to translate, it's to see differently. To call a river by its living name is to feel its pulse. To call your grandfather not my relative, but Nimishumis, is to restore a sacred thread that connects body, land, and spirit. And something strange began to happen. The more they spoke, the more they remembered. Stories that had been half forgotten came back in full. Elders, once hesitant, began telling tales of skywalkers, dream catchers, water monsters, and the voice that hides in wind. The stars came back, to not just as points of light, but as names.mang, the loon, constellation that leads the soul home. By Bunaikianini, the winter maker, Miss Homus Chijig, the grandfather sky. These weren't abstract ideas. They were coordinates for living, for knowing when to plant, when to gather, when to grieve. Now, inside tribal classrooms, you might see a child point to Orion and say not hunter, but a Kivanzi, the old man, or whisper a prayer in Ojibwe before dipping a paddle into the water. The language isn't fully restored. Not yet. It still teeters. Some days it feels strong. Some days fragile. But it lives. And living things grow. So the Lac View Desert band keeps speaking not just for fluency, but for reconnection. To restore what boarding schools tried to erase. To remind the world that English may have mapped this land, but Ojibwe named it. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen at the edge of the lake on a still winter night, you'll hear it. A child naming the stars, a grandmother correcting him softly, a people remembering the language that once hid everything holy in plain sight. And as the words rise once again, so does the memory of the ones who never stopped believing, even when their names were erased, even when their prayers were stolen, because some truths can't be translated, only remembered. It doesn't look like much from the outside, just as squat, beige building tucked between pine trees and a stretch of snow-covered road in Watersmeet. But inside, it holds something sacred, something revolutionary, a clinic on sovereign ground, owned by the Lac View Desert Band, staffed by native doctors, open to everyone. This wasn't supposed to happen, not in a place like this, not with a tribe so small the government once tried to fold them into others. Not after centuries of being pushed to the margins, medically neglected, historically ignored. But the Lac View Desert Band has never done things the expected way. They built their own clinic. Then they opened its doors to the world. It began with a question. What if sovereignty could heal? Not just politically, not just legally, but bodily. What if the same sovereignty that let them govern land, run a casino, teach language could also allow them to offer medicine their way, without red tape, without the crushing slowness of bureaucracy, without waiting for permission. In 2006, they found their answer, using tribal funds and the profits from their casino enterprise. They launched the Lac View Desert Health Center, but they didn't stop there. They went digital, nationwide. They created the first tribally owned mail-order pharmacy that now serves patients across all 50 states. What began as a clinic became a national lifeline inside the clinic. The walls are lined not with sterile certificates, but beadwork, elder photos, tribal artwork. There's medicine here, yes, prescriptions, vaccines, checkups, but also something deeper. You're seen. You're not just a number. You're part of the circle, and that circle is growing. This isn't just native health care. This is health care on native terms. The tribe uses its sovereign rights to bypass unnecessary red tape, allowing quicker access to medicine for everyone, regardless of race. They didn't create walls. They created bridges. It's an inversion of history, where once native bodies were neglected by state hospitals. Now it's the tribe extending care to the country. Where once they were told they didn't exist, now they're feeling a need the nation can't keep up with. They've even begun challenging drug pricing systems, daring to negotiate costs directly with manufacturers, cutting out middlemen. Why? Because they remember what it's like to be denied medicine. Because they know that health is power. Because their ancestors once had only plants and prayers, and even those were criminalized. But here's the thing. They haven't abandoned those roots. Inside rooms and elder visits, they still use cedar tea, still burn sweet grass, still teach young people that healing is not just physical, it's emotional, spiritual, and ancestral. A grandmother with arthritis is just as likely to leave with prayer beads as with pills. A child with nightmares might be given dream teachings, not just sleep aids. It's a place where Western medicine and traditional knowledge sit across from each other. Like old friends, different tools, same goal. That's what makes this clinic different. It doesn't ask patients to choose between past and present. It says, bring both. We'll make room. And what began as a small tribal project has become a quiet revolution. Other tribes now look to Lac View Desert as a model. National news outlets have taken note. Government officials are asking questions. But the tribe remains grounded. This isn't about fame. It's about responsibility. They're not trying to be saviors. They're just trying to be sovereign, and in doing so, they've created something rare, a space where native healing practices are not just preserved, they're practiced. A structure built not for profit, but for people. A legacy of medicine rooted in memory. The Lac View Desert Health Center proves something vital, that sovereignty isn't just a concept. It's infrastructure. It's staff meetings. It's pharmacy shelves. It's tribal ID cards at the receptionist's desk. It's community wellness that ripples outward. Because when the land is yours, when the language is returning, when the old stories are being told again, you start to build things. Real things. Things that last. And so, tucked quietly in the woods of the Upper Peninsula, stands one of the boldest symbols of native self-determination in modern history. A clinic on sovereign ground, serving anyone who walks through the door. Because for the Lac View Desert Band, healing isn't about lines on a map. It's about circles that include, remember, and restore. They were told it would go out, that the old ways were dying, that their language was too soft for the modern world, that songs couldn't feed you, and dreams couldn't protect you, that their people were a footnote, a faded memory, a flickering ember in a cold world. But they were wrong, because the fire never left. It just needed new hands to carry it. Today, a new generation rises from the forests, lakes, and digital screens. They wear ribbon skirts and sneakers. They sing ancient songs into smartphones. They smudge before skateboarding. They are the fire carriers of the Lac View Desert Band, the ones who walk forward with the past in their pockets. They are not waiting to inherit tradition. They are reshaping it. In language programs, teenagers now joke in Ojibwe. They text each other phrases their grandparents were once punished for saying aloud. In kitchens, college students return to learn how to cook with wild rice and maple. In ceremonies, young girls are once again gifted their first moon teachings. They call themselves language warriors, water defenders, decolonizers, but they also call themselves simply Anishinaabe, the people. This generation carries burdens, yes, trauma, statistics, blood memory, but also vision. They are fluent into worlds, the one that tried to erase them and the one they are actively rebuilding. They've created online moccasin-making tutorials, hosted digital language challenges, written poetry about boarding school ghosts and ice fishing memories. Some have even begun writing sci-fi stories in Ojibwe, imagining native futures that stretch across galaxies but remain rooted in Earth. In spirit, in fire-dotted powwows, you'll see them in mixed regalia buckskin and beadwork beside Jordan sneakers and Bluetooth headphones. It's not disrespect, it's a remix, a reclamation. They're not pretending to be their ancestors. They're listening to them, and sometimes the fire gets heavy. Some youth still feel the ache of absence, the silence left by grandparents who didn't live long enough to see this revival. Some still carry shame that was never theirs to begin with. Shame planted by systems designed to erase. But here's the truth. They are not alone. The elders are watching, guiding, smiling, not as gatekeepers, but as gardeners watering these young flames, whispering stories that help them burn brighter. One elder put it best. They are the ones we dreamed would come, because every act of cultural survival was a prayer for these kids. Every hidden drumbeat, every whispered word, every bent cedar branch, all of it was done with them in mind. And now they are here on TikTok, at treaty rallies, inside immersion classrooms, in forest walks with language apps playing in their ears. The sacred fire is being carried not in temples, but in them. In their choices, their laughter, their resistance, even their names are part of the revolution. Many are reclaiming Ojibwe names. Some name their babies in ceremony with words that mean lightning, peace, or one who returns. These names are not just labels, they are declarations. And slowly, the world is noticing. Universities are creating positions for native language specialists. Environmental groups are consulting tribal youth on water defense. Even federal courts have been forced to acknowledge their voices. But the fire carriers aren't waiting for validation. They know who they are. They are the living continuation of treaties, the descendants of dreamers and warriors and weavers, the ones who were prophesied long ago in the Seven Fires teaching. The seventh fire, they say, would be lit by young people who return to the ways, who choose the right path forward. Even when two roads split, and now, we watch as they choose. They are choosing sweat lodges over silence, dream teachings over despair, healing circles over erasure. They are building what comes next, and in doing so, they are proving that the fire is not fragile, it is ferocious, not ancient, it is eternal. Not fading, it is spreading, because every child who sings in Ojibwe, every teen who plants tobacco with her grandmother, every boy who dreams of deer and remembers the word for snow, is carrying it forward. And so, in the woods of northern Michigan, where the snow whispers and the water holds secrets, something powerful is happening. The fire carriers walk softly, but they burn bright. They say history is written by those who hold the pen. But the story of the Lac View Desert Band was never theirs to write. It was whispered in the rustling pines, sung in the splash of oars, carried by the steady pulse of the lake's tide. For 150 years, the world looked away. They were declared lost, forgotten, erased from maps and laws. Yet through it all, the people stayed. The ceremonies continued beneath thick forests. The birch bark scrolls remained hidden beneath mats and beneath memory. The water kept their secrets, and the wild rice held their promise, because they were never gone. You cannot erase a people who speak with the stars, who dream with the bear, who live with the water. You cannot erase a people whose stories flow in rivers and whose songs ripple through generations. Today, Lac View Desert stands not as a relic of the past, but as a vibrant, breathing nation. Their casino hums with life, yes, their health. Clinic offers healing on their terms. Their language classes echo through school halls. Their youth carry fire in their voices, in their movements, in their dreams. But most importantly, they carry the memory of never being forgotten. The elders who survived removal and denial sit beside children who will carry the fire into a future no one can erase. The sacred fire that once flickered in secret lodges now burns openly at community gatherings. The water that once whispered only to those who listened now speaks through activists, scientists, and storytellers alike. The Lac View Desert Band has moved beyond survival. They are thriving. They are remaking what it means to belong. In every drumbeat and every prayer, there is a refusal to disappear. In every dance step and every word spoken in Anasazi, there is a reclaiming of voice. In every act of protecting water and land, there is a rebirth of responsibility. Their story teaches us that erasure is never final, that identity, like the lake's current, is persistent, that the past can be carried forward not as a burden, but as a foundation. When you stand on the shore of Lac View Desert and the morning mist rises, you feel it, the breath of ancestors, the pulse of a people who never stopped walking their path. The light shines differently here. It is softer, deeper, not blinding, but steady, because the fire was never extinguished. It was only waiting for the right hands, waiting for the right time, waiting for the people who remember. We were never gone. We were always here. And now, the world is finally ready to see. The Lac View Desert Band's story is far from over. It is only just beginning. Thank you for walking this journey. May the fire you carry be strong. May the water you protect run clear. And may the stories of those who came before continue to light your way.